Story 1. I woke up in my room, the sun gliding through the window, gently touching my face. Spring was already in the air, that special smell of the earth that the first warm rain awakens, and the freshness that fills every corner of the city. At that moment, I realized that the holidays had finally arrived. The thought of having 2 whole weeks of free time ahead became one of the most pleasant things one could imagine. My day started as usual. I got out of bed, stretched, feeling all my muscles stretch after a night's rest. The noisy city outside the window, the rare passers-by, the cars driving, all this was part of the morning routine. However, I did not want to rush. It was a vacation, and at such moments I felt how important it was to simply enjoy the time and not run through to-do lists. I took a quick shower, feeling the water wash away all my tiredness. When I came out of the bathroom, breakfast was already waiting for me. Hot toast, boiled eggs, some olive oil, and a cup of black coffee. Nothing complicated, but for me it was a real pleasure. I ate slowly, unhurriedly, allowing myself to think a little about my plans for the day. After breakfast, I brushed my teeth and put on my usual summer clothes. Simple shorts and a t-shirt. There was no point in wearing anything more complicated because I had a walk in the fresh air ahead of me. My plan was simple. Take a golf club and a fishing rod, go to a golf course with a nice stream running next to it, and spend the day enjoying nature. I loved those quiet days when there were no obligations. When I walked out onto the course, I knew that before me was a whole world of silence and easy movement. Of course, playing golf itself was not that exciting, but it gave me a chance to think and take a break from the world for a while. And if I managed to catch a few fish, then it would be perfect. I headed to the park where the golf course was. It was quiet and peaceful. The place seemed to be hidden from the bustle of the city and had its own rhythm. I picked up the club and took a few long swings at the balls, enjoying the moment. The air was so fresh that even my thoughts became clearer. I felt free and relaxed, as if the whole world was mine alone. But something was wrong. When I looked at my watch, I realized that I had spent more time than I expected. Time on the field flew by. Slightly surprised, I looked around, but at some point I felt that something had changed. A shadow. There was no shadow. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, and suddenly noticed that night had fallen around me. This was impossible, because the sun had just been high in the sky. I wanted to go to the car, but something stopped me. Something in the air changed. I looked around and my gaze fell on my golf club. It was as if it was at rest, as always. But at that moment, I felt my gaze drawn to it. I don't know what exactly drew me to it, but at that moment, something inside me seemed to light up. I walked towards it, and when I took the club in my hand, something strange happened. It was as if it was breathing. Yes, exactly, as if it were a living being, and not just an ordinary piece of sports equipment. I almost dropped it when it made its first rustle, but that wasn't all. The moment I took my hand away from the club, it seemed to come alive, tore itself from my fingers, and jumped into the air. I recoiled, watching in horror. Am I going crazy? The same thing happened with the fishing rod I had left by the water. As I turned around, it moved right in front of me and stood on its legs, as if it were an animal ready to attack. I stood there, not understanding what was happening, gritting my teeth and preparing for the worst. They couldn't be real. It was simply impossible. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was too scared to do anything. Fear froze my reality. These things couldn't be real, but their eyes were alive. Red dots that glittered in the night, and blood flowed from their mouths that were once ordinary tools. I retreated, but they began to move towards me, making strange sounds as if they were living creatures. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run. There was no one around me, and I was trapped. These strange, creepy objects that were supposed to be just a golf club and a fishing rod were now pursuing me. I felt a cold shiver run through my body. How could I get out of this situation? In a panic, I suddenly realized that I couldn't stay here. Something had to be done. Something had to be done. My head was boiling with thoughts, but they still didn't lead me to solutions. My eyes darted around the field, and at some point I noticed the nearest vending machine, which had chocolate in it. Without any confidence, I ran towards him. I barely realized what I was doing, but in a panic I grabbed the chocolate bar and gave it to these strange creatures, hoping that at least something would work. But they just stared at me, emptiness in their eyes, and blood kept flowing from their mouths. What should I do next? I didn't know what to do. Panic, fear, and unimaginable confusion enveloped me like a thick fog. My hand was still holding the chocolate bar, and my eyes couldn't tear themselves away from these strange creatures that had once been ordinary golf and fishing implements. But now they were alive. I couldn't understand how this was possible. How could something as harmless as a golf club and a fishing rod suddenly come to life. I tried to remember all the possible explanations, both mysticism and strange scientific theories, but none of them seemed logical enough. They stood before me, their faces ugly, their eyes glowing red. I felt fear grip me again. I couldn't understand what was happening. All I knew was that I had to get away. I took a slow step back, but they watched my every move, like predators who never take their eyes off their prey. It was like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. My mind couldn't accept what was happening, but my body was telling me one thing: run. I took a few more steps back when suddenly they spoke. Their voices sounded distorted, as if they were not just objects, but something much more sinister. I could hardly believe my ears, but they spoke in a way that I could not help but hear. "Why are you afraid of us?" said the golf club, its metallic sound sharp as the teeth of a beast. I froze. I couldn't believe I was hearing that voice. It wasn't supposed to be real. I tried to find the words, but they wouldn't come. I stood there hypnotized. "We are just your things. You chose us yourself," said the fishing rod, and there was something piercing in its voice that caused a cold fear in the soul. I cringed. This was impossible. This was simply impossible. I didn't know what to think. All my feelings and thoughts were intertwined, and I felt like I was going crazy. My mind refused to accept reality. I was sure that I would wake up now, and all this would be just a nightmare. But no, I didn't wake up. "You can't be real," I blurted out, and I immediately regretted my words. The second I said those words, I looked at them. Their faces had become even more ugly, as if they had taken the form of the nightmare itself that I didn't want to believe. Their eyes had become brighter. They were now glowing a fiery red, and blood was pouring out of both their mouths. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no longer just a joke or a terrifying figment of my imagination. This was real evil. Their forms were no longer just ordinary objects, and they did not resemble the things I knew. They had become something incomprehensible, unimaginable, and very dangerous. I knew I couldn't stand there forever. I had to run. I clenched my fists and hurried a few steps toward the exit of the field, but as soon as I turned, I felt fear overwhelm me. They didn't move, but I knew they were watching me. It was as if these ugly creatures knew my thoughts. Suddenly, I heard them again. They started talking. But now their words weren't just a demand. They sounded like a threat. "Feed us," the fishing rod whispered, its voice filled with not only anger but also hunger. "We're hungry," added the golf club, its words sounding like a death sentence. My mind couldn't accept what was happening. I froze, trying to figure out what to do. They looked at me with their bloodshot eyes, and I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I wanted to run, but something inside me made me stay. I felt that if I took a step, they would follow me. I had to do something to stop this horror. I looked at them, trying to think of something to calm them down. I didn't know what they wanted, but if I could just get rid of them, I realized that I simply couldn't get rid of them unless I found a way to satisfy their strange requests. I didn't know what these creatures were, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't let them attack me. In desperation, I noticed a vending machine nearby. It was dark, menacing, but maybe there was something there. I rushed to the machine, holding the chocolate bar I had just bought. It was all I had to offer, a crazy offer. But what else was there? I jumped up next to the machine and threw a chocolate bar in their direction, as if hoping it would satisfy their hunger. I didn't know what they wanted, but I hoped that at least this would work. It was a strange decision, and I knew it might be stupid, but I had no choice. "What is it?" asked the golf club, its voice growing more and more menacing. "It's chocolate," I replied, trying to remain calm. "Just eat it. You'll like it." They stared at the chocolate as if it were something completely foreign. I felt my patience and hope melting. I didn't know what they were expecting. Perhaps they were expecting something more exotic than just a sweet treat. I picked up the chocolate bar and ate it myself, desperately hoping that it would somehow calm them down. "Weren't you going to eat it?" I asked, feeling my anxiety growing. "No," said the golf club, and its answer sounded less like a refusal than like another blow to my logic. "Please bring us something to eat. Bring us an animal." It was too much. I couldn't believe what they were saying, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to do what they asked. I just got up and ran. The next day, I woke up feeling as if the night before had been more than just a nightmare, but some inexplicable occurrence. I was agitated but strangely calm, as if I were waiting for something I couldn't understand. I had long since realized that there was something wrong with these things. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole situation was far from random. These terrifying creatures, my golf club and fishing rod, were not just objects that had come to life. They were something far more sinister than I could have imagined. However, I had to continue living my life. I decided not to give in to fear and not to let these strange events completely control me. My goal for today was clear: I was going to visit the zoo. It was one of those places where I could get away from the world, relax, and enjoy nature. I planned to just spend the day looking at animals and forget about all the strange events of the last few days. When I arrived at the zoo, I felt relieved. On the outside, everything was as usual. Families with children, people walking among the cages with animals, a cheerful atmosphere. I walked for a long time among the enclosures, watching the animals, until I reached the place where the most exotic and rare species lived. These were the most amazing creatures I had ever seen, and their calm made me forget, at least for a moment, about everything that was happening in my life. But as I approached the antelope enclosure, a strange feeling came over me. I looked back and saw how suddenly the whole atmosphere around me changed. My gaze fell on the sky. It was darkened, as if night had come. Although the day was not over yet, my legs became heavy and my heart began to beat faster. Was all this happening again? I tried to ignore it, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore my feelings. It seemed as if the shadow of night was covering the entire zoo. I hurried to the exit, but I didn't make it. Suddenly, there was a terrible noise, and I saw people starting to run away in panic, saving their lives. I didn't know what was happening, but the horror in their eyes was obvious. I looked around, trying to figure out what the problem was, but soon I realized that this was my nightmare. They had come for me. My golf club and my fishing rod came to life, and they were not alone. Other things followed. Everything I had ever used, they came, and their eyes were as red as the club and the rod. They moved, consumed by hunger, by the desire to destroy. They came for everyone. I stood there not knowing what to do. I couldn't run. Everything around me was filled with these strange creatures, and it was clear to me that it wasn't just these two objects that had become alive. Everything around me had become part of this nightmare. I saw a dead ostrich, which had just been alive. Its eyes were empty and dead, and strange bloodstains were spreading across its body. A zebra was lying next to it. Its body was mutilated, as if it had already been eaten, but it still retained the remnants of life. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was all happening so fast. There were dead animals all around, but the ones that were alive were moving towards me. I tried to believe that this was just an illusion, that it couldn't be real, but the terrible cry of the lynx standing right in front of me made me realize that this was a real nightmare. I couldn't stay here. These creatures, these sinister living things were coming for me. They were chasing me, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. I ran without looking back. I ran without understanding how to get out of this situation. My body moved on its own, not allowing me to think about anything except salvation. I ran past the peacocks that stood motionless and quickly saw the entrance to the zoo building. Maybe I could find shelter there. But before I could reach the door, a new horror appeared around the corner. All the dead animals began to move. I saw an ostrich, a zebra, even a small capybara. All of them turned into zombies, and they weren't the only ones. The people who had been running for their lives before were now part of this nightmare too. They were no longer who they were, and now they were chasing me, driven by the same hunger. I ran towards the museum building, not knowing where to look for the exit. These creatures followed me without stopping. Suddenly I heard footsteps, heavy, loud, approaching. I looked back and saw them. A golf club and a fishing rod, which were now racing along with a horde of zombie creatures. They were the leaders of this monstrous army. With every step I took, I felt like I was losing strength. But I knew one thing. I had to get out. I had to save myself. I quickened my pace, trying to find a safe place. The zoo had become hell. Every animal, every person I met on my way was part of this endless nightmare. Even the rare dinosaurs that once lived in this zoo had become living monsters, tearing everything in their path. I finally reached the museum, but it was too late. The closed doors I had hoped for were now the only thing that would stop me. All I could do was think about how to survive in this scary world full of dead and living creatures. I felt my body freezing with fear, and I was sure that with every step I was getting closer to my death. The zoo became not a place of rest, but a trap in which I found myself the only living creature among these nightmarish creatures ready to destroy me. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding and my thoughts were in a tangled mess, unable to focus on anything. Everything around me seemed like some kind of surreal nightmare, but I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I was completely alone, and I needed to find a place where I could hide from these monsters, from these living things that were chasing me. Images from the zoo flashed through my head again. Zombie animals, dead people. It all turned into one endless panic. I tried not to think about what had happened to the animals in the zoo and what awaited me next, but I still couldn't rid myself of fear. The task was clear: find shelter. And I hoped that the museum would be a place where I could at least catch my breath a little before planning my next move. The Fossil Museum. I had always found this place interesting and calm. I expected to see ancient exhibits, ancient dinosaur bones, their reconstructions and educational lectures, but now everything felt completely different. I didn't know what to expect. The museum I had just entered didn't seem the same as before. It was quiet, too quiet, and even the air inside felt heavy, as if something was hanging over the place. I walked quickly past the first display cases, clenching my fists, trying to gather my strength. Suddenly, a strange coldness gripped me, and I involuntarily stopped. Why had it become so cold in here? After all, I had just been outside. And even if it was not warm, the temperature inside the museum was always pleasant, but now the air was strangely damp, like in a dungeon, and the cold penetrated to the bones. I felt it getting dark. The light that had been soft and diffused began to fade, as if all sources of light were slowly disappearing. I wanted to go back, but as soon as I looked back, the sky outside the window turned black, and I did not have the strength to move back. I think it was similar to the moment when I first noticed how the night came suddenly, without giving the slightest chance to escape it. I kept walking, despite the fear that was creeping deeper into my soul. I passed many ancient bones, past dinosaur skulls, and came to a stand with fossilized ornithomimus remains. I stopped, as if something had forced me to do so. It was a strange feeling, as if I was not alone. My gaze was caught by one thing, and I could not tear my eyes away. I saw movement, something or someone running past, and I knew that this could not be my imagination. Something was moving, something completely unnatural. But what happened next was far more terrifying. I felt something strange envelop me. A blue light, as if from above, was penetrating the museum, and everything was becoming tinged with its dull hue. It was cold and bright at the same time, and I felt goosebumps run down my spine. This light was not normal. It was alien, ominous, as if the world itself was beginning to fall apart around me. Suddenly I heard a sound, and not just a sound. It was a noise, as if something gigantic were moving. I looked around. Everything had become even stranger. The light grew brighter, but there was no source, no explanation. The display cases began to shake, as if some force were pulling them in a different direction. I took a step back, not understanding what was happening, but then it dawned on me. They had come, a golf club and a fishing rod. I knew they weren't just ordinary things. They were part of something far more terrible, and now they were here. They were in this museum. At first I couldn't understand what was happening, but then I saw them. They were coming for me, and they weren't alone. These creatures, these living things, were starting to animate the fossils. I watched in horror as the ancient bones began to move. The ornithomimus, whose skeleton I had just been examining, suddenly came to life, its fossilized body moving as if cursed by a spell. The golf club, which had once been a simple golf tool, was now riding on the ornithomimus, and the fishing rod was riding on a giant moa. These giant ancient birds began to move, and I saw their bones sparkle in this strange light. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I didn't know where to go. Everywhere I looked, something completely unthinkable was happening. The fossils began to come to life, and everything around me was turning into a terrible reality. I couldn't stay here any longer. They were following me, and I didn't know what to do. I rushed to the door, but it was closed. I needed to find a way out. I needed to get out. But everything was obscured by this blue light that continued to grow and consume everything around me. I felt something cold touch my back. Turning, I saw them again. The golf club, that ominous object, was now sitting on the ornithomimus, and its eyes were glowing red. The fishing rod was also nearby, and I knew that escape was no longer possible. But at that moment, I heard something strange. Before I could look back, the light swallowed me completely, and I found myself in complete darkness. Everything became dark, as if I had fallen into another world. I didn't know what was happening. Everything around me disappeared, and I found myself in the grip of this horror, trying to find at least some way out of this trap. After I got out of the museum, I just wanted to run as far away as I could, find a safe place and rest, just for a little while. I felt like my entire body was drained of all its strength, like something inside me had simply burned out. I had been through too much in such a short time. The zoo, the museum, and this scary, strange force that had been following me. But this wasn't the end. I didn't know what was coming next. I thought that maybe if I went to a frozen yogurt place, I could just relax a little, take my mind off it. Maybe I could be comforted by those moments of serenity when I simply enjoyed the sweet treat that always gave me some sense of normalcy. With every step, every movement, I felt the anxiety creeping up on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still trapped and that at any moment it would all start happening again. I didn't know how long I could stay like this, but I knew I had to. I just couldn't let myself break. I walked into a frozen yogurt place, hoping that it would help me forget for at least a few minutes. Everything was as usual. A pleasant atmosphere, soft lighting, cozy tables. There was a woman behind the counter who seemed to be busy preparing another portion of yogurt for another customer. I approached the display case and thought about it. It was so normal that it even made me feel a little better. I chose my favorite chocolate yogurt, added gummy worms, my usual sweet treat that always gave me a little joy. I sat at the table, slowly stirring the yogurt with a spoon, trying to focus on the taste, on this small moment of silence. My mind, although it tried to nestle in this moment of peace, kept returning to what had happened. Every memory of the dead animals at the zoo, the living fossils at the museum, the horrible creatures that had haunted me. All these thoughts returned and did not allow me to enjoy either the taste of the yogurt or the atmosphere of the cafe. I had barely finished my dessert when I suddenly noticed movement. Something unusual was happening. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked at my spoon and then at the yogurt display. The lights began to dim, and that strange blue light I had seen before began to appear again. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, but it was getting brighter and brighter. It was the same light that enveloped the museum, the same light I had seen at the zoo. I stood up abruptly. My hands felt like ice, and my heart started pounding with unimaginable force. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shake. I took a step back, but it didn't help. Everything around me began to move. The yogurt machines began to shake as if they were something alive, as if this technology had become part of the nightmare that was haunting me. I saw several yogurt jars, as if possessing a will of their own, begin to move, rolling off the shelves. But that was not all. I could not believe my eyes when I saw the yogurt itself, in some macabre manifestation, begin to spread across the floor, forming frightening traces that moved and sparkled. It was too much. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, otherwise I would become part of this nightmare. I felt my feet become slippery from the yogurt, which was now something alive. I tried to push myself away from the table to escape, but I was stopped by a strange force that began to rise in the air, creating unimaginable chaos around me. At that moment, I realized that this was no coincidence. This was a repeat of what had happened at the zoo and the museum. These creatures, these living things, had come here to haunt me, to destroy me. I noticed how objects began to burst out from behind the display case where toppings and additives for yogurts were usually kept. They were moving, as if they had become alive. Marshmallows, which were usually used to decorate desserts, began to jump on the shelves, as if they, too, had become part of this horror. Everything around me was turning into a real nightmare. I didn't know how it could be, but I knew for sure that this strange force that brought things to life had now taken over everything that was nearby. I tried to run to the door, but again I felt something holding me back. Suddenly, a golf club appeared in front of me. It stood right by the door, looking at me with its eerie red eyes, ready for another attack. I jumped back in horror, not knowing where to go. I had no choice but to continue running. I realized that running here was pointless. There was no safe place in this environment. I ran outside, feeling again that suffocating air that permeated everything around me. The diner building was behind me, but I knew that if I didn't do something drastic, these creatures would soon follow me everywhere. I stopped and looked around. Shocked, I knew I had to find an end to this nightmare. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop them. The night was coming again, that blue light again, the living things that had haunted me again. And I didn't know how much longer I could stand this unimaginable world. The next day I woke up, but I didn't feel any relief. I thought that the night would bring at least some peace, but when I woke up, I realized that fear had become an integral part of my existence. These terrifying events that haunted me continued into the next morning. I tried to collect my thoughts, but every time I began to think about what was happening, I was overcome with fear. These things, living objects that followed me, were unpredictable. The golf club and the fishing rod that were chasing me were part of something much more terrible than I could have imagined. But I couldn't sit still. I knew I had to find a way to stop this nightmare, and the only place where I could get rid of my anxiety a little bit seemed like the planetarium. After all, this place had been an oasis of knowledge and calm when I used to go there. At that moment, it seemed to me that the planetarium could become a temporary refuge. Maybe in this amazing place, I could feel at least some security. I hoped that no anomalies would be able to penetrate there, and that I would be able to enjoy at least one day without these living objects haunting me. As I approached the planetarium building, I felt a familiar sense of relief. It was brief, but palpable. It was quiet and calm inside. I walked into the main hall where the exhibits on space, star systems, and planets were usually located. The walls were decorated with magnificent images of distant worlds, star nebulae, and planets. Everything seemed so distant and beautiful. How I had dreamed of this. To simply stand and look at these images, to forget everything that had happened to me in the last few days. I walked into the room with the planet models and was about to lose myself in my thoughts, but then I felt a strange change in the atmosphere. As soon as I found myself under the dome of the planetarium, the light began to dim. I looked up. The sky depicted on the dome began to change its color, darkened, and the stars began to move, as if the cosmos itself was changing. It was strange because everything that had happened lately seemed like some kind of nightmare, but now I could no longer understand where reality ended and where something else, abnormal, began. My eyes squeezed shut as I saw the image on the dome begin to spin faster and faster. Then I realized that something was wrong. This light, these strange movements. Suddenly, as if on command, I found it hard to breathe. The air became thick, muffled, as if the cosmos itself did not want me to stay in this place. The walls began to change, and I felt the space around me distort. It was as if I had entered another dimension, a world where time and space lost all meaning. I tried to get up and walk away, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shake. The dome above my head began to darken, and the lights in the room turned into bright flashes that began to outshine everything around me. Each flash was like lightning, and I couldn't understand what was happening. It was so strange that I felt panic overwhelm me. At that moment, I felt like a circle had closed around me. I was trapped, and nothing could save me. Then I saw them again. The golf club and the fishing rod, the same creatures that had been chasing me all over the city, were now here, in this dome. They weren't just physical objects. They looked like living beings made of those objects, but they were far more terrifying. Their eyes glowed red, and they moved as if they were controlled by some dark force. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I froze, watching them approach me. The golf club rose into the air as if it didn't need to touch the ground. It flew straight at me, and the fishing rod followed, twisting in the air like a snake. I heard their metal scraping and prepared myself for the worst. But instead of attacking, they stopped. Something dawned on me. I realized that they couldn't hurt me right now, that they were acting as if they had some other goal in mind. And then, as if the world had turned upside down again, I felt a strange movement around me. The space on the dome changed its appearance, and silhouettes appeared before my eyes. Huge stars, planets, and dark nebulae. I saw how they began to move, as if living their own life, but at the same time they were part of the force that controlled these living objects. I didn't know what it all meant. It was unimaginable. I tried to collect my thoughts, but the stars on the dome began to change. They began to blur, as if they were not there at all. Instead of stars, an eerie darkness appeared in their place, which began to absorb the light and the space around me. It was almost impossible. I looked at it all, and my thoughts became completely uncontrollable. It seemed that I had lost touch with reality again. It seemed that the planetarium itself was turning into a trap. The stars and planets began to spin and distort, creating fog and shadow in the air. The golf club and the fishing rod came to life again. I did not know how to get out of this hell. The only thing I could do was try to find a way out, even if it was useless. I felt the fear growing stronger. I was overcome by an unbearable feeling that I would not be able to get out anymore. The understanding that these creatures were following me did not leave me. They were not just objects. They were something much more dangerous. And I did not know what to do to survive. I couldn't understand how it had all come to this. Something in my life had changed a long time ago, but I didn't know when or how. You know, there are moments when you suddenly realize you've been involved in something so absurd that your conscious mind refuses to accept it. I could still feel that moment when the golf club and the fishing rod appeared in the planetarium. Everything that happened after that was just a series of disasters that wouldn't stop. As soon as I ran out of the planetarium, I felt that everything around me became deaf and frightening, as if nature itself had decided to isolate me from everything. I ran, not knowing where. Only one thing was clear. I needed to find a place where I could feel safe, even for a moment. The streets were empty. The people had disappeared, as if the whole world had suddenly erased itself and left me alone in this nightmare. I quickly headed toward the forest. Why? Maybe because I always thought of nature as a place of refuge. I would feel safe there, at least for a while. I ran into the forest, hoping that if I was far enough away from the city, these monsters, these living things, would not be able to find me. All I knew was that I couldn't stay outside. The shadow of night was already covering everything, and that ominous blue light that I had grown accustomed to seeing was starting to appear again. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the trees. Trying not to think about what had happened to me in the last few days, I concentrated on simply moving forward. The forest was familiar and yet alien. It held all sorts of dangers. Still, I felt like at least I didn't have to live through this nightmare within the city walls. The forest seemed like a refuge that could hide me from everything. But the reality was more complex than I could have imagined. As I went deeper into the forest, I realized that something was wrong. The light began to fade, and it was as if the trees were casting a shadow around me. This was not a normal process. I looked around and saw how a thick darkness began to fill the space between the trees. Something invisible was moving there among the branches. And of course, I realized that this could not be just a play of shadows. Suddenly, for a moment, the forest was silent. No noise, no rustling, no animal sounds. Everything froze as if the forest itself was taking part in this nightmare. I stopped. At that moment, it became clear to me that I was not alone. Someone was waiting for me in the forest. I could feel it with my whole body. My heart started pounding and my chest tightened. I tried to breathe calmly, but the air became heavier and heavier. And then I heard a rustling sound. Something was approaching me. My legs seemed to stop obeying me. I turned and noticed a silhouette appearing in the darkness. The same silhouette I knew. The golf club and the fishing rod were appearing in front of me again. They didn't move like before. Didn't just stand there in front of me. I felt like they were part of this forest. Part of the dark shadows that lurked in its depths. Their metallic surfaces reflected the faint light, and their eyes, red and bloody, glowed so brightly that I could barely stand them. I tried to back away, but the feeling of them following me, stalking me, was too much. I kept moving, unsure of what to do. The forest was dark and dangerous. It was becoming more and more distorted, as if reality around me was blurring. I pushed through the dense undergrowth, trying to find a path that would lead me to open ground, to safety, but the forest was swallowing me deeper. I began to understand that this place was not just a forest, it was part of something bigger. This place was a trap, drawing me into its web. I ran past the old trees and bushes, but those horrible creatures didn't leave me alone. Their red eyes followed my every step. I knew they were waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. My panic grew with each passing moment, but I couldn't stop. I knew that if I let myself give in, if I stopped, they would catch up with me. I couldn't let them catch me. I tried to run, but the trees seemed alive. They squeezed me tighter and tighter, giving me no escape. With every step, the forest became darker. My eyes were starting to get tired from trying to see through the dark undergrowth. Every step I took echoed in my head, making me feel like I had lost touch with reality. I no longer knew how much time had passed. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this forest, where everything was distorted. And there was no certainty that I was still in the world I once knew. I felt cold. My fingers became icy. My breathing became ragged. It seemed to me that I could not stand it any longer, that the forest would swallow me up. But at that moment, when I was almost ready to give in, I heard a scream, the scream of a hawk. The scream was so sharp and loud that it made me flinch. It pierced the silence of the night like thunder, and in that moment, everything around me changed. I felt the forest begin to change, as if that scream was a signal for normalcy to return. The trees began to straighten, the light became brighter. I couldn't understand what was happening, but everything around me began to return to its previous appearance. The forest became a normal forest. The shadows disappeared, and I began to breathe easier. I looked around. The horror that had haunted me was gone. It was quiet. I was standing in the forest, and this time I felt like I was going to escape this nightmare. Everything was back to normal, as if I had just gotten out of a trap, but I knew I would never be the same again. Whatever had caused this nightmare, I would never forget it. And if ever the golf club and fishing rod come to life again, I'll be ready. Story 2. My dad never let me have a phone. Not that I complained much, but it was one of those things that slowly cut off my connection to normal life. I couldn't understand it, not at my age. Why couldn't I, an adult and mature for my age, just have this piece of technology that seemingly every kid in the neighborhood now had? All I wanted was to be able to text a few friends, watch funny videos on the bus, or listen to music on the go. But my dad always said no, like he knew something I didn't. His fear was real. I knew he'd lost Kyle, his older brother, the man I barely remembered, whose name was now a curse on our house. That had been 5 years ago, but it still hung in the air, like an unbearably heavy fog, hiding something you didn't want to find. Kyle was gone, and though his disappearance was still shrouded in mystery, all we knew was that he was with someone we didn't know. The stranger, the online predator who manipulated young souls, was one of the people my father blamed for everything. I remember him always saying, "You never know who's behind the screen. People can be anyone." He stood at my door every night, making sure I slept without touching the computer or turning on the TV. I couldn't even order a new game online. Every purchase became a potential source of suspicion for him. And so, when I reached the age when I began to feel more independent, I had to face his decision once again, not to allow me to have a phone. I wish I could say I had come to terms with it, but that was far from the case. My life would have been easier with the ability to socialize with friends like everyone else. Instead, I was left without a world of my own outside the four walls of our home. Instead of sharing my joys with someone, I was left to my own devices, with the only consolation being the computer that sat in the corner of my desk. I could sit there for hours reading the news, watching videos, but I always knew that one careless mistake, one wrong move, and my father would take me away from there again. I even thought about starting a journal, but in reality, it wouldn't have been much better than remaining silent within the walls of this house. When I found that I could make some money working part-time as a grocery bagger at Quick Mart, I knew this was my chance. I had saved $200, not a lot of money, but enough to buy a cheap smartphone. Devin, one of my friends, sold me his old Motorola, and I couldn't wait to finally escape into my own world. I downloaded a few apps, social media, YouTube, Spotify, and even created my own Reddit account. It was my little world, a world where I could be free, if only for a moment. But my fear of my father was too great. I knew that if he found out I had a phone, I would be in trouble. I hid it under the floorboards of my room, where Kyle's bed had once been. The room was mine now, and I found it easier to be alone with myself than to face his cold gaze in silence again. Every night when I went to bed, I reminded myself that the phone was hidden, that it was far away, and that I didn't have to think about it, but I couldn't shake the guilt that I was essentially lying to my dad. I tried to justify it by thinking that Kyle was Kyle, and I was me, and I had nothing to hide. It wasn't like I was going to meet someone from the internet or get sucked into some dangerous game. All I wanted was a chance to be a little more normal, even if just for a few minutes. When I first turned on this phone, I felt a strange excitement. It was not quite what I expected. I felt that this phone was not just a gadget, but a kind of portal that took me far away from this boring and dangerous reality. It was like entering another world, where everything seemed simple and understandable. Notifications began to appear on the screen, and I felt alive. I could see that the world existed beyond my home. One night, as I sat in the dark watching YouTube videos, I decided to Google Kyle's name. I wasn't sure what it would give me, but something inside me was pushing me to do it. I wanted to find something, anything, any clue that might explain what had happened to him. And then a few minutes later, the results popped up on the screen, and I saw an article. It was dimly lit on an obscure news site. The headline froze me in my tracks. Father investigated missing child case. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the text, and a chill ran through me. At the bottom was a photo of my dad standing next to his car. He looked the same as always, with that cold expression on his face. For a moment, I thought he might be there, next to me, staring at me through the screen. At that moment, I heard his footsteps approaching my room. I quickly hid the phone under the floorboard and managed to close my eyes and pretend to be asleep. He opened the door and, standing on the threshold, said, "Good night, Bailey." I said, "Good night, Dad." But then I remembered that I couldn't help but ask, at least in his presence, about Kyle. My voice was weak and the words didn't sound right, but they came out anyway. "Is there any new information about Kyle?" His face hardened like stone. He didn't like talking about him. He always deflected such questions as if they didn't matter. He was sure that nothing good would come of me digging into these topics. Dad said that we shouldn't talk about him, that it wasn't my concern, and as always, he closed the door behind him. When I returned to my bed and tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, under the floor, something was still hiding. I always knew that Kyle was more than just a brother. He was the one who protected me, who always stood by my side when I couldn't cope in this cruel world. He was the confidence I needed. Even when I was little, I saw him holding our father back, covering me with his body so I wouldn't be the center of his rage. Now that he was gone, I felt an emptiness that seemed to pull me down into a dark abyss. When Kyle disappeared, I became almost invisible. I didn't know what to do, how to act. Before he disappeared, I often ran into his room, took something from his old things, and he never objected. He was always there, like that invisible support that you didn't have to ask for. But when he was gone, everything changed. The relationship with my father became even more strained, and I found myself alone with what was happening inside our house. My room used to be mine and Kyle's. We shared space, shared things, shared interests, shared ideas. It was our place, our territory. But when Kyle disappeared, our room became mine. I knew it would never be the same again. Everything was mine, and I was alone, like a ship that had lost its captain. I tried not to look at the empty space on the bed where Kyle had once lain. I tried not to think about his things, hidden in closets and drawers. They were so close, yet so far away. My father, with his tired eyes, his silence, was no longer a person to talk to. When Kyle was alive, he always managed to calm his anger for a while. He was the shield I hid behind when things got tough with my father. Kyle was the one who stood up for me when I was in yet another unpleasant situation. But now that he was gone, I didn't know how to continue to exist in this house. I remember the time Kyle took a punch from my dad after I accidentally knocked over a can of red paint in the garage. My dad was furious. He was screaming like crazy, oblivious to everything around him. I was afraid he was going to kill me, and only Kyle, standing between us, took the blows. When he got beat up after that, and someone asked about the purple bruise under his eye, Kyle said it was from playing hockey. He never complained, never showed his pain. It was his specialty to always be there, to always protect me, even if he was suffering. But now he was gone, and I was alone. As time went on, my father became more and more withdrawn and hard. He never let me forget that Kyle had been the one protecting me, and losing him was as bitter a loss to me as it was to him. He spoke less, his voice cold as a metal ring. He never talked about what had happened in his life after Kyle had disappeared, and I probably didn't want to know. His silence suggested that he couldn't or wouldn't be the man he once was. He had become more than just a father. He had become a ghost that haunted the house, and no one knew what to do with it. I worked at Quick Mart, bagging groceries, and that was all I had left to do. Work, make money, and try not to think about what was going on in my house. It was easier at work than at home. There I was, just one of many. No one who really knew me. But really, I was trying to forget about what was happening with Kyle, about what was happening to our house. Sometimes I thought I might have a chance if I hadn't given up, if I had kept looking for answers. But every time I came home, it all came back. The emptiness in the room, the unfinished memories that wouldn't go away. I knew my father was still looking for Kyle. He was still investigating, still looking for answers. But none of his attempts were ever getting anywhere. I knew he wasn't telling me everything. He was hiding it from me, like we both knew there was no point in talking about it. But I knew that if Kyle hadn't disappeared, things would have been different. When I got the phone, everything changed. I hid it under the floorboards in my room, but it was my way of distracting myself from the present. It was my little secret, my little freedom. I didn't want my father to know that I was trying to find answers, but I couldn't stop looking for something that could explain it all. One evening, as I sat in the dark, thinking about what had happened to Kyle, I felt a deep sense compelling me to type Kyle's name into a search engine. I knew it could be a mistake, that I might end up on some meaningless website or article, but I kept going anyway. The search results hit me, and there was the article. The photo of my dad sitting in his Lexus was terrifying to me. The whole moment was so strange and uncomfortable. I felt a chill as I realized that not only was my father continuing to live with this pain, but he was trying to hide something important from me. When he walked into my room, I couldn't explain what I was feeling. He looked at me and I felt his gaze become more wary, as if he knew I was hiding something. But I remained silent. I didn't know yet that I would discover something more terrible than just an article on the internet. Sometimes the silence is louder than any scream. It sits behind you, breathing down your neck, slowly filling the room. After the night I saw the article about Kyle and hid my phone under the floorboards, something changed in the house. At first it was just anxiety, a subtle tremor inside that I could chalk up to guilt or insomnia. But then there were sounds. The first night I thought I was imagining it, a light scraping noise, not loud but unpleasant. It was coming from somewhere near the floorboard where I had hidden the phone. I remember lying in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, curled up, holding my breath, listening. The rustling sound was repeated 3 times. Scratch, scrape, scrape, as if someone was trying to scratch the wood with their nails, slowly, carefully. I told myself it was just rats, old house, old wood, hollow walls, animals maybe. It was the only rational explanation I could cling to convince myself that nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But deep down I knew it was something else. Rats couldn't breathe like that. Yes, breathing. A few nights later, when I heard the scraping sound again, I realized it was followed by a slight whistling sound. Like a person breathing, but distorted, like someone choking or breathing through wet cloth. It was coming from right under the board. Not loud, but just enough for me to hear it in the complete silence. I lay there not moving. My mind was telling me to get up, to look, to check, but something inside me resisted the urge. I just couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought my father in the next room could hear it. I pressed my ear to the pillow and closed my eyes, trying to pretend that I didn't hear anything, that this was all just a dream. The next morning I asked my father, not directly, of course. I carefully brought up the sounds in the walls. He immediately snapped, "Rats! They're everywhere in the old house." His voice brooked no argument. I nodded, though my doubts only grew. He didn't elaborate, didn't show interest, didn't offer to call a pest control specialist. It was as if he knew it wasn't rats and just didn't want me to continue. The next few days became an unbearable wait for the night. I knew that with the onset of darkness, the grinding would return. Sometimes it appeared immediately, sometimes after several hours, as if something under the floor was waiting for me to start to fall asleep. It became routine, like an alarm clock in reverse, only not to wake you up, but to keep you from falling asleep. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'd put in my headphones, turn on the music, but I could still hear it. The sound cut through the noise, as if it were mental rather than physical. It was with me, inside, as if someone were whispering in my ear from inside my head. I was starting to go crazy. I thought losing my mind was something far away that happened to other people, but now I felt like it could be very close, a step away, a millimeter away. I didn't sleep, really, for whole nights. I tried to hold on during the day, but my body was starting to betray me. My hands were shaking, my head was spinning. I was becoming invisible in my own life. No one at school noticed, except maybe Devin, but he didn't ask questions. He was the kind of person who reads someone else's pain without intruding. Sometimes that's the best kind of friendship. When the grinding had been going on for more than a week, I started having dreams. Not the usual ones, ghost dreams. The kind that leave you tired, not rested. Kyle was in them. He stood at the door of the room in the dark, without words. His face was blurry, like glass fogged with his breath. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared. And then, one moment, he'd point down, to the floor, and disappear. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding, staring at the same place he'd pointed. By that time, I already knew I had to look under the board. I had to see what was there, but fear was binding me like chains. I even approached a couple of times. I squatted down, stretched out my hand to the corner of the board where it was slightly raised, but I still couldn't bring myself to lift it completely. When on the 15th night, the grinding became unbearable, loud, furious, like someone was banging their nails into the wood, the board began to wobble. I felt it breathing. The wood seemed to rise and fall like a rib cage. In a panic, I grabbed my heavy textbooks and laid them on top. For a while it stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. In the morning, I put away the books and with trembling fingers lifted the floorboard. There was no telephone. In its place was a hole the size of a palm, deep, black, as if the night itself had decided to settle under my floor. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to say that I screamed, but my voice wouldn't rise. I leaned closer, as if my body moved on its own, without my conscious desire, and I heard it. It was breathing, that same whistle, not loud, not threatening, weak, tired, as if someone was slowly, laboriously inhaling air through the earth, as if his lungs were filled with dirt. I recoiled. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, not knowing what to do. It was all wrong. It was inexplicable. It was not rational. But in my heart, where there had once been pain from loss, there was now another feeling growing. Scary, terrifying, but full of hope. What if? What if that thing under the floor is him? What if Kyle isn't gone? What if he's still here? What if all I need is to listen? And then I realized the truth is closer than it seems. I don't remember exactly how I spent the day after I discovered the hole under the floor. Everything was a blur. School passed me by like a dream. The teachers' voices muffled, as if I was watching through cloudy glass. I walked down the hallways, staring at the floor, my head buzzing like there were insects inside. I didn't have a phone. It seemed like such a small thing compared to what I'd found under the floor, but it was the only way I had to feel like I belonged to some world, some way out, some answer. And then it was gone. The phone was gone, and with it my connection to reality, my secret freedom. But what scared me most wasn't that the phone was gone, wasn't that there was a hole. It was that I knew that there was someone in that hole, that someone was breathing. I'd heard the sound too long, too clearly, to convince myself it was just rats. Rats don't breathe like humans. They don't exhale in pain. They don't send shivers up the back of your neck the way they go quiet, like they're listening in response. I felt it, a presence. It wasn't malicious. It was desperate, more like someone trapped in the darkness, reaching out to me, for me to hear, for me to understand. I couldn't tell my father. Even if I tried, he wouldn't listen. He had closed himself off long ago. I saw him drink, not openly, but secretly, like thieves or cornered animals. I noticed how his hands shook when he came home from work, how his eyes became glassy. He spoke little, and almost always dryly. There was a gap between us that couldn't be bridged. We were both prisoners in this house. Only I was in my room, and he was in his past. Over and over, my thoughts returned to Kyle. He was gone, and my father had said, "We don't talk about him," and I didn't. I stayed silent, because if I started talking, I wouldn't be able to stop. I'd spill it all. How much I missed him, how much it hurt to see his empty bed, how I remember every night how he protected me, and how I felt like he was still out there. A couple of days after the phone disappeared, I finally took the plunge. During recess, I asked Devin for his number. He didn't ask, he just gave it to me. I dialed the number. My heart was pounding like I was jumping into ice water. The beeps were the longest I'd ever heard, and then a click and a voice. Through the noise, through the distortion, through the pain and the space, I heard it. The voice I knew, even if I heard it in 1,000 voices. And then everything changed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound. There was no scraping, no rustling, no breathing. But I felt a presence, like the emptiness beneath the floor was now waiting. Not scratching, not angry, not calling out, just waiting. And I knew it was my turn now. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to do something. For the first time since Kyle had disappeared, I felt like I wasn't just a victim of events, like I had a path to follow, even if it led to a place no normal person would ever go. I spent the next day tense, as if about to jump off a cliff. Every hour, every minute dragged on like an eternity. I didn't eat, I didn't speak, I didn't look at people. I just waited for the evening. And when the sun went down and the house was silent, I quietly got out of bed, took down the rug, put away the books, and uncovered the floorboards again. The hole was now clearly visible. I lit an old flashlight that was lying around in our storage room and pointed the beam inside. The light hit a dense darkness that swallowed everything. No bottom, just damp earth around the edges and a cold coming from below, like from a grave. The emptiness smelled of rot and something strangely familiar. Maybe the smell of a garage after rain. Maybe the smell of Kyle's old uniform after training. I stood there for a long time listening, but the hole was not breathing. No rustling, no sound, only emptiness. Then I took a long ruler and started lowering it into the hole. At some point, it touched something soft, like fabric, or skin. I pulled my hand back, and the ruler fell into the darkness. Something inside began to move, slowly at first, then faster. I heard breathing again, muffled, distorted, but now much closer. And then I realized there was someone there. For real. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a person, or what was left of a person. I sank to the floor, sat up, and pulled my knees to my chest. My chest tightened, like I was about to cry, but there were no tears. I remembered Kyle standing between me and my father. How he'd shielded me from the blows. How he'd say, "It's okay." He'd always said that, and I'd always believed it. And now I was sitting next to a black hole in the floor, telling myself, "It's okay." Only I knew, no, it wasn't okay. There was nothing okay left. There was just emptiness beneath my feet, and the voice on the phone telling me, "Don't trust him." I didn't know who not to believe. My father, myself, sounds, reality. I knew only one thing. I can't retreat now. Something is calling me from this black hole. Something is asking. Something remembers me, and I have to find out what. When you live in fear for a long time, it becomes a habit. You begin to distinguish its shades. A dull background horror, like a weak current in a wire under your skin. Sudden panic attacks, as if someone bursts into the room without knocking. And the strangest thing, the one that weaves into everyday life, imperceptibly breathing down your neck, becoming a part of you. It was this fear that haunted me all the time, while I lived under the same roof with my father, with his shadow, with the past that he stubbornly tried to get rid of, with the silence that became the new language in the house. But now there was another fear, different in nature. It didn't come from my father. It didn't creep up on me from the outside. It was inside, beneath my feet. I felt it the way you feel an internal wound. You know it's there even if you can't see it. And that knowledge slowly began to take everything away from me. Sleep, appetite, peace. I became different. Quiet, mechanical. I went to school as if to a bunker where people hide from war. I did my homework without reading the assignments. I swallowed food without tasting it. I looked at people without seeing them. All that occupied my thoughts was the hole in the floor and what was inside it. Every night I opened the board, sat down next to it. It wasn't that I expected to hear anything. It was more like visiting a grave, a strange ritual, touching a secret I couldn't name, but which pulled me deeper. Time lost its outline. I no longer knew exactly what day of the week it was. I counted only the nights. In each one I listened, in each one I waited, and more often it seemed to me that I heard movement, light, hesitant, as if someone was crawling out of the ground beneath me, slowly, as if from viscous mud. I didn't know whether I was afraid of it or whether I was expecting it. Sometimes I would squat for a long time at the hole, running my finger along the edge, touching the cold wood. I would put my ear to the crack and freeze. Once, I think I heard a wheeze, barely audible, as if someone was trying to speak, but the voice was stuck in a throat full of earth, or memories, or death. The most frightening thing about all of this was that I wanted to be Kyle. I didn't just want it, I believed it. I believed it despite everything my mind told me, despite logic, facts, reality. If someone had told me such a story, I wouldn't have believed it. But once I was inside it, I couldn't brush it off. I knew my brother's voice. I remembered his breath. I felt his presence the same way you feel when someone is watching you from the darkness. Kyle disappeared a year ago, suddenly, without a trace. He left the house on a Friday night and never came back. My father locked himself away almost immediately. We didn't even have a real funeral, just an empty space, just a photograph, just pompous words that no one could say seriously. I didn't understand then how you can go on living when someone who was a part of you just disappeared. And now I knew. You don't go on. You just change. You become someone else, a shadow, an echo. Kyle wasn't just a brother. He was my barrier between myself and the things I couldn't stand. When my father became violent, Kyle came between us. When I lost confidence, he found words for me. When I became afraid, he kept the fear from growing. And then he was gone, and all that weight fell on me. And now through the darkness, through the impossibility, he is here again. Not whole, not alive as before, but present, like a spirit caught between worlds, or like a body buried and trying to get out. I tried to find an explanation. Maybe my father was hiding something. Maybe what happened to Kyle wasn't an accident at all. Deep down, I knew my father would never forgive Kyle for his powers, for being better, for being kinder. Maybe he was even jealous, or maybe more, but I couldn't think about it openly. I was afraid that if I followed this path to the end, I would see too much that I couldn't forget. So I returned to what was nearby, to the hole, to the breath, to the faint warmth coming from the darkness, to the memory of the voice. One night I sat near the hole until almost dawn. This time it was different. There was no scraping, no breathing, but there was a presence, palpable, heavy. The air around the board seemed to thicken. I reached out my hand and felt something, somewhere deep below, reaching out to meet me. Not a hand, not a body, a feeling, a flash of recognition. It cannot be shared. It cannot be proven, but it was there. I wanted to speak, to say out loud that I was here, that I hadn't forgotten, that I still remembered how he'd shielded me from blows, how he'd put his hand on my shoulder when I cried, how he'd said everything would be okay, even when it wasn't, but the words stuck in my throat, remained inside. Maybe that's where they were supposed to go, deeper, to him. I closed the floorboard at dawn, carefully like closing a coffin, but each time with the thought that this is not the end, that I will return again, and that he is still there, in the ground, in the darkness, in some space between life and death. And maybe in the end, I will go down to him. Ever since I first heard Kyle's voice over the phone, I couldn't see the house the same way. It felt less like the place I'd grown up in, and more like a cage dug into the earth. Every room smelled of something forgotten. Every object, every crack in the wall, felt like a part of something bigger. Fragments of the lie that had covered our family. My father began to act wary, as if he sensed that I knew something. We avoided each other like animals in the same trap. His eyes, when they accidentally met mine, were dull, full of suppressed tension. I saw him begin to hide the flask of whiskey in his old jacket again, the same one he had once worn when he took us fishing. He did not resemble that man now. His shoulders were hunched, his movements were sluggish. He did not raise his voice anymore. There was no need. Everything about his silence was heavier than a scream. I started looking. Not because I wanted to expose my father. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe confirmation, maybe the truth, or at least justification for my fear. Sometimes we are not looking for answers, but at least some traces to cling to, so as not to fail completely. I started with the garage. where Kyle and I painted our bike as kids, where I once spilled a can of paint and he took the blame. I couldn't look at that corner since then. It always seemed like a place where something had happened that no one was supposed to see. Now I'm back there, like an archaeologist digging through the ashes of my own family. First, I found an old toolbox. Inside were bits of wire, a rusty hammer, some old gloves. I fingered them as if they could speak, as if time could slip from their surfaces if I touched them long enough. In the far corner, under a shelf, I noticed a shoebox. There was nothing special inside. Photos, newspaper clippings, old notes that had once hung around the refrigerator. But at the very bottom, under a folded piece of newspaper, was a thin folder. Inside were printouts of email correspondence. My first thought was that it was one of my father's colleagues, but in the subject line of the emails, I saw Kyle's name. The letters were strange, harmless at first glance, discussions of games, music, even movies. But between the lines, there was something disturbing. I felt persistence from one of the interlocutors, someone older, someone who knew how to manipulate. The letters began with friendly phrases and then imperceptibly became more and more personal. I read them, feeling how everything inside me went cold, not from the words, from the subtext. I understood that my father had found these letters earlier, and most likely it was then that something inside him finally broke. I didn't know if he'd done anything official about it, if he'd gone to the police. It wasn't clear from the papers. It looked like he'd collected evidence, but he hadn't handed it over, or didn't have time, or didn't want to. Maybe he decided he knew what to do, and maybe that was Kyle's final step into the unknown. That night, I couldn't go back to the room. I sat in the garage, staring into the darkness, listening to the house creak above my head. I felt that underneath all of this, underneath all the walls, floors, and bricks, the truth was hidden. And not some abstract, judicial, documentary truth, but the real, living truth. The truth that breathes at night under the boards. By morning, I was back upstairs and I opened the floorboard again. The black hole no longer seemed like just a hole. It was now the center of everything. The answer. The mouth of a funnel into which my life was slowly being sucked. I sat with her for a long time. I wasn't afraid. There was no fear left in me. Only a scorched field inside where doubts used to be. I felt that what was down there knew everything about me. It knew my hesitations, my thoughts, my sense of guilt. And it waits for me to take the next step. I didn't tell anyone, not even Devin. He still joked, said things like, maybe it's just a raccoon in the basement. But I had gone beyond explanation, beyond rationality. It wasn't a raccoon. It was him. That evening, after my father had gone to bed, I walked quietly down the hallway, past the creaky step. In my hands were a flashlight and a cord that I had found in the closet. I didn't think I would climb inside. I just wanted to look, to see, to be closer, at least a meter, at least for a second. I lowered the flashlight tied to the handle into the hole. The light darted across the damp ground, illuminating the side walls. Somewhere in the depths, something metallic flashed, or bone. It was hard to tell. I leaned closer, holding my breath. From the depths came the sound of breathing again. Familiar, hoarse, tired. It wasn't frightening. It was almost human. And that was the unbearable thing about it. I knew that breath. I had lived next to it for years. It was part of my childhood, my home. I slowly rose up without closing the hole, left it open, for the first time. And I realized now I will not back down. I don't know when I crossed the line. It wasn't a sudden decision, a flash of insight, an act of desperation. It was more of a slide, like a drop of water slowly trickling down a pane of glass until it disappears beyond the frame. I was sliding there, where there were no longer any boundaries between what was possible and what couldn't be explained. Kyle was calling, or maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was my subconscious, maybe the voice in my head, maybe my conscience, but it sounded like him, and that was enough. I began sleeping closer to the hole, at first just on the floor next to it, wrapped in a blanket. Then with a pillow under my head, my ear almost touching the crack. I listened all night long. I no longer hid the hole. I didn't block it with a board. I didn't put books in it. The hole wasn't a threat. It became a window, a place of communication, where I was closer to my brother than in all the months of his absence. It seemed to me that he was there, for real, not in my imagination, not in my fantasies, but in something deeper, more real and terrible. No one would have believed it. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself if I'd been on the other side, but I heard him move. I heard his claws, or were they nails, scratching at the ground, hearing him cough, hearing him breathe. That hoarse, ragged breath became the rhythm of my nights. I listened to it like a child to his mother's heartbeat. I was afraid that one day he would disappear, that it would stop, that I would be alone again. I no longer wondered how he got there, what had happened to him, how he was even alive. Those were questions for the outside world, for adults, for psychiatrists, for newspapers. I was inside. I was part of it. And so it wasn't how that mattered to me, but what next. With each passing day, I felt him getting closer, that the distance between our worlds was shrinking. Sometimes I even felt a warmth, faint, barely perceptible, under the floor, as if a heart was beating in the ground. And with each passing day, I could no longer separate myself from that hole, as if a part of me was already there. My father didn't notice, or pretended to. Maybe he knew. Maybe he knew I was gone, not physically, but deeper, in my soul. I barely spoke to him. I looked at him like he was a stranger. His routine was the same. Work, flask, news, sleep. It was like he lived in a world where Kyle never existed. And I lived in one where he was still here. I started carrying around things Kyle loved. An old baseball cap, a broken keychain from his backpack, a picture of the two of us by the lake. I didn't know why. I just wanted him to know that I remembered, that I was keeping, that I was with him. Sometimes I'd put them next to the hole. Sometimes I'd put them right inside on the edge of the crack, like I was leaving an offering. I wasn't expecting a miracle. I just felt like it was needed. At night, when everything was especially quiet, I heard something moving below. Not like an animal, but like a man, slowly, with difficulty, crawling forward. Sometimes the ground shook beneath me. I didn't know whether it was from effort or anger or from pain, but I lay motionless with my eyes wide open, feeling my breathing synchronize with what was below. I started thinking about how to get to him. At first, my thoughts were vague, just fantasies. Then I got a shovel from the garage. I put it next to the bed, in case I decided to do it. Sometimes I looked at it like a weapon or a key. It seemed to me that if I dug deeper, I would see him. I would reach out, I would pull him out, or I would leave on my own. I lost track of time. The days blurred together. School became a formality. I stopped talking to Devin. My phone was gone. Everything that connected me to my old life was gone. All that was left was silence and breathing. And then that night came. The wind was especially harsh. The house groaned, as if it knew something irreversible was coming. I was awake, sitting by the hole, holding Kyle's old toy dinosaur with the broken leg. He used to carry it everywhere. I whispered words, not prayers, not spells, just words. Mine. Warm, reassuring. So he'd know I wasn't afraid. So he'd feel less alone. And then from the depths a sound came. Not a breath, not a rustle, a voice. Weak, almost dissolved in the darkness, but clear. It called my name. More than once. Not like an echo, but like a brother. Like a call that is impossible not to answer. I stood up. I picked up the shovel. Slowly, almost solemnly, I began to dig. The boards shifted. The earth gave way easily, as if it had been waiting. I dug without feeling tired. Only my heartbeat. A dull rhythm coinciding with something pulsating below. I went deeper. Each layer of earth was a step forward. And when I felt close enough, I stopped. Knelt down. Reached my hand out into the darkness. Without thinking, without hesitation, simply because I knew he was reaching out to me too. And the moment my fingers touched the cold, damp skin, I knew I would never be alone again, that it was all over, or had started anew. The darkness covered me like a blanket, and it became calm. We were together again. Story 3. I have lived in this house for 5 years now. It is a secluded place in the forest, just a few kilometers from the nearest settlement, where it is almost always windy and foggy. The perfect place to forget about everything, withdraw into yourself and focus on work. But recently I began to notice that something is wrong. At first it was just strange sounds coming from the night. I thought they were the usual sounds of the forest. Branches cracking under the weight of nocturnal animals, or perhaps some beast prowling the area. But gradually the sounds became more and more distinct, as if someone was quietly walking towards me and then suddenly stopping. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the strange sensations grew stronger with each passing day. My dog Harley has always been loyal and calm. She was not afraid of sounds, was not afraid of the night darkness like many other dogs. But now she behaves strangely. In recent weeks, she has become nervous, often running around the house, looking out the window as if something or someone was bothering her. And I noticed how she occasionally looks at me with anxiety in her eyes, as if expecting something terrible to happen. One night, after a particularly strange evening, when Harley was again running restlessly around the house and barking sharply at the window, I could no longer sit still. I decided to go outside to figure out what was going on. The forest was plunged into thick darkness, but the moonlight was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the tree trunks and undergrowth. I felt a little strange, as if someone was watching me. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and only questions were spinning in my head. What was happening, and why did I feel this strange threat in the air? I had walked a few meters down the forest path when I suddenly heard a soft, barely perceptible sound that made me freeze. It was a soft barking sound, not like Harley's usual behavior. I recognized it immediately, although I was a little puzzled. It was the same bark that Harley gives when something or someone unfamiliar approaches the house. But what really surprised me was that this bark did not come from my dog. It was coming from somewhere far away, in the dark depths of the forest, but it sounded exactly like Harley's voice. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned and ran back, not daring to look into the dark woods, afraid of what might lurk in their shadows. When I returned to the house, Harley was sitting by the door, exhausted and sweating. She was panicked, and her eyes were searching for me, as if she were trying to tell me something. I leaned down to pet her, and she calmed down instantly, but the anxiety in my heart did not go away. Those strange sounds repeated themselves for several nights in a row. A bark, similar to my dog's voice, coming from the forest, but not hers. One day I decided to go out again, taking a flashlight and a gun with me just in case, but something inside me screamed that I was wrong. I was not sure that I would meet someone or something there, but this inexplicable anxiety did not leave me. With each step along the forest path, I felt how the air became heavier, and the forest began to seem alive. Every tree, every bush, even every branch on the ground resembled something alien, dangerous. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that this was just forest magic, that my feelings were exaggerated, I felt that I lacked clarity. I never saw any obvious signs of a human or animal presence, but that night, something was different. When I got home, Harley was sitting by the door as usual, but now she barked in a way I had never heard before. It was a deep, continuous bark, and it filled the house with a strange, vague menace. I couldn't figure out what she was trying to communicate, but I knew she sensed something I couldn't. Now I could no longer simply ignore what was happening. I began to study the forest, trying to find out what was hidden here. However, my attempts to find at least some explanation ended in failure. The next morning, when I checked the place where the strange barking was supposedly heard, I found only tracks. Deep tracks in the soft soil, as if something very heavy and large had passed through the forest path. I can't quite put my finger on what I'm feeling right now. The sense of security I once had is gone. The forest, where I once felt at peace, now feels unspeakably alien. And even though I know Harley is my only support, I still feel a sense of uncertainty creeping up on me. Fear. I'm no longer sure that I'm alone in this house. That night, I couldn't sleep. There was a strange chill and heaviness in the air that made it hard to relax, as if everything around me was filled with anxiety. Harley was asleep next to me, but I could feel her body tense. She still felt something I couldn't understand. My mind tried to rationalize, but every time I tried to focus, the strange silence that surrounded the house only made me more anxious. I got out of bed, stretched, and walked carefully into the kitchen. It was dark, only a faint light from the street lamp coming through the window. I poured myself a glass of water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everything was too quiet. Even when I stood in the room just listening, there were no familiar sounds of the night, no rustling leaves, no sounds of the wind, no usual nocturnal animals. Suddenly I thought I heard footsteps, but they were too soft to be real. I listened again, but heard nothing. Maybe it was just fatigue, I thought. Maybe I was thinking about it too much. But Harley raised her head and barked. It was short and urgent, and I felt her fur stand on end. She was looking toward the window, where the shadows of the trees moved bizarrely against the moonlight. I went to the window and looked around, but there was nothing in the darkness that could explain her behavior. Sometimes the forest plays tricks on the imagination at night, and even the most ordinary things can seem frightening. But something inside me still wouldn't let me rest. Harley kept staring at one spot, her gaze focused like someone who sees something I can't see. I decided to go outside, hoping that the fresh air would help clear my head. I took a flashlight, opened the door, and stepped into the dark yard. The wind was cold, and I felt it blowing on my skin. The forest surrounded the house on all sides like an ancient wall, protecting it from the outside world. The night was so dark that it seemed that all the outlines had become blurred. Footsteps on the wet ground sounded dull, and even the wind could not disperse this oppressive atmosphere. I didn't know why I decided to go into the forest. The feeling that someone was watching was becoming more and more obvious. My inner voice was screaming at me to go back into the house, but I kept walking forward as if something was pulling me. I could feel the damp earth under my nails, and with every step, this feeling of force pulling me deeper into the forest grew stronger. I didn't notice how I was lost. The forest was getting denser and denser, and I couldn't figure out where I was. All I could think of was that I shouldn't have come out here, but I kept walking, as if I was being led by something unknown. The sound of footsteps continued, but now it was louder, as if someone was walking next to me, or even in front of me. I froze, listening. The sounds became clearer. Footsteps, but they weren't mine. There was something wrong with them, as if they were fake, unnatural. I felt something shift behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing to see in the darkness. My mind began to spin. I retreated back, trying to get back to the house, but I couldn't find the right path. I moved through the forest like in a nightmare that would never end. That strange sound of footsteps did not stop, and I was more and more convinced that something or someone was hiding in the shadows. I had to go back. My mind screamed at me to do so, but my body did not obey. Suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, I thought I heard my own footsteps. It was the very sound I had been trying to avoid, but now it sounded as distinct as if someone was standing behind me. I turned around sharply, but again saw nothing. Almost losing all my strength, I followed the tracks, hoping to find at least some kind of landmark, but they disappeared, dissolving into the darkness. Suddenly, I heard a loud barking. It was Harlene's voice. She was close by, and I could feel her presence, as if she was barking in desperation, knowing that I was in danger. I did not know how, but I felt that I had to return to the house. In that same second, I rushed to the side toward the light, which now seemed to me the only salvation. The faster I moved, the louder the barking sounded, until finally I saw the familiar outlines of my house. Harley met me at the door barking, but this time her eyes were not only wary, but scared. I knew she wasn't having it any easier than I was, and even though it all seemed like a nightmare, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, and it was far worse than I could have imagined. The forest became quiet again. I closed the door behind me and felt the tension ease a little, but it was not a relief. I did not know what was happening, but one thing was clear: I was not alone. Night had fallen upon the house again, but this time it was not as quiet as before. I felt something invisible pressing on the walls, as if the forest around me was watching me. Harley, who usually found secluded corners to rest, now did not leave my side. Her eyes glittered in the darkness, wary and anxious, like those of an animal that senses trouble. I sat on the couch trying to concentrate on something, but my thoughts were confused, not giving me peace. Those steps, that strange sound in the forest, everything continued to spin in my head. I closed my eyes, trying to forget about what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. With each passing moment, it was becoming more and more difficult to ignore this inner cold that was clinging to me. I couldn't calm down, and although it was clear that the forest was the only place where strange events could happen, thoughts about it did not give me peace. My hand unconsciously reached for the lamp to turn on the light, but I knew that it would not help. The bulb, this fragile light, could not fight what was surrounding me. I stood up and started walking around the house, feeling the walls closing in, the air getting thicker. My heart was beating faster, and I knew that if I didn't get myself out of this state, it would consume me. Opening the door to the kitchen, I tried to distract myself a little. However, as soon as my steps led me to the window, I saw it again. A shadow. The forest stood in darkness, and I couldn't discern what it was, but the feeling of fear did not leave me. I knew that no one but me could feel what I felt. No one entered the forest at this time of night, and nothing happened around the house. But suddenly I heard the footsteps again. It was not an ordinary sound. They were not like the sounds of the forest. These steps were strange and unnatural, as if someone was following in my footsteps. The slight crunch under my nails was too obvious, too alien. I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked around. Harley began to get nervous. She slid along the wall, trying to hide behind the furniture. She took each step with extreme caution, as if she knew this place was becoming more and more dangerous. I crouched down next to her to try to calm her down, but even her presence couldn't help me find peace. And suddenly, as if hearing my inner voice asking me to stop, I felt the cold air pierce me through and through. It was not the usual cold of the night. It was something alien, unimaginable. And I knew that it was not just the atmosphere of the forest. Suddenly, a shadow flashed outside the window. A strange movement made me jump. Something rushed past. A moment, and again silence. I did not know what it was, but my intuition told me that I should not go beyond the boundaries of this house. I approached the door cautiously and scanned the yard again. Nothing. Empty, but the forest seemed alive, its shadows still swaying, though there was no wind. I couldn't understand how I hadn't noticed it before, But the forest was much closer than I thought. Strange, ominous sounds emanated from it, as if someone or something was on the edge of visibility. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I went back into the house and closed the door. With every step back, the forest became more frightening. It wasn't just dark and silent, it was alive somehow. I was sure that if I looked out the window, I'd see someone standing in the trees, but I couldn't look. I didn't know what I'd see, and the more I thought about it, the worse it became. Harley paced the room restlessly, glancing out the window more and more often. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. It was real. There was something in the forest that shouldn't have been there, and I realized that if I stayed here, I wouldn't be able to get rid of this feeling. But what could I do? I knew I couldn't leave because something was holding me back. My body wouldn't obey. Then I went back to the window. Harley barked. My eyes followed her gaze, and I saw him. There, at the edge of the light, where the forest began to thicken into absolute darkness, stood a figure. I couldn't make out who it was. It was standing in complete shadow, but I knew it wasn't just a tree or an animal. Someone was there, someone who was always watching. My heart sank as the figure took a step forward. He or she seemed to be moving toward me, but each step was unnaturally smooth. The same crunch, the same sound, but it couldn't be. I knew it was something that shouldn't be. I felt the air around me thicken again, and I did everything I could to avoid looking. As the night wore on, the fear became more and more apparent. That stranger standing there in the woods was just the beginning. My attempts to ignore what was happening bore no fruit. The more time I spent in this house, the more I felt that it was full of something strange, inhuman. I sat in the room watching the windows, and in my head, like an ominous chant, those strange steps and the feeling that I was being followed kept repeating. The forest, it seemed, did not give me peace. Its dark silhouettes outside the windows became something familiar, but at the same time frightening. When the night swallowed the world again, and all the sounds of nature seemed to have died down, I couldn't help myself. I took the flashlight and went to the door, torn by a vague feeling. Harley was sitting by the window, watching something in the darkness with a wary expression. She didn't come to me, didn't look me in the eye as usual. She was in a state I didn't recognize. It was like fear, some instinctive terror she couldn't explain. I tried to talk to her, but she just barked and ran to the corner of the room, hiding. I looked back, feeling my heart beat faster. It was time to act. With every step towards the forest, I felt more and more afraid. I opened the door, and the cold night air immediately enveloped me, making me shiver. At that moment, I realized that no light bulb, no window could stop what I was feeling. Peering into the darkness, I saw only shadows. But this time, there was something different. I could have sworn I saw movement in a part of the forest where there had been nothing before. There, between the trees, something was moving. Something thin, long, with unnatural movements. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shake, and I was overcome with terror. Every step towards the forest became heavy, as if the ground resisted my movement. I took one step after another, and my gaze clung more and more tightly to that figure that flickered in the darkness. I knew that I had to get closer to understand what it was. With every breath, it became more and more difficult not to stop my gaze. And then, finally, I found myself at the edge of the forest, and suddenly everything around me became quieter. The forest was silent, and not a single sound disturbed the silence. I stood there, waiting for what would happen next. From the moment I entered this area, a strange feeling did not leave me. The forest became like a living creature, waiting for me to become a part of this nightmare. When I finally got to where the figure seemed to be hiding, I felt its presence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, the same way you feel the cold in a dark room. I turned around and noticed the leaves under my boot nails starting to crumble, as if someone was squeezing the forest. I took a few steps back, but then stopped again, as a strange rustling sound came from far away. My gaze fell again on the place where the figure had been hidden. Now I was sure that I had seen something more than just a silhouette. It was not a person, not a creature that could be ordinary. It moved unnaturally, as if it were playing with reality. I realized that this creature was either somehow manifesting from another world, or it was a creation of something I could not understand. My hands were shaking, and I clutched the flashlight in my hands. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Those steps, that crunch, everything was becoming more real with every passing moment. I wanted to scream for this nightmare to end, but only silence surrounded me. I felt the creature approaching, as if it was beginning to surround me, but I couldn't move. I stood there in that dead corner of the forest, knowing that I couldn't get back to the house. And suddenly, as if in a dream, I felt something touch my shoulder. Thin, icy fingers. I stood there, frozen. how much time had passed since I realized that I wasn't alone in that forest? I turned around, but I saw nothing. The one who was next to me had disappeared. Now I stood at the very edge of despair. The creature whose presence I had felt was gone, but there remained a feeling that it was somewhere nearby. I wanted to go back to the house, hide in a corner and never come out, but I couldn't. I had to find out what was going on here. I took one step back, then another. I moved slowly, feeling the fear consume me, and with each step I lost touch with reality more and more. It felt like the forest was pulling me towards itself, like a tree that was impossible to resist. I felt like I was part of this nightmare. And then, that shadow appeared before me again. The creature was there, but it didn't move. It stood there, as if it was waiting for me. Everything that happened after that incident was like a chain of dreams, in which reality and illusion intertwined in one endless loop. I didn't know what was happening. Every morning began with the feeling that I was waking up again in the same nightmare that never ended. The forest, the shadow, the footsteps, all of this continued to haunt me like an unbearable burden. But what scares me most is that I'm no longer sure where reality ends and this nightmare begins. Harley was different again. She didn't come near me, she avoided my eyes, and she didn't bark like she used to. I noticed a change in her behavior, and it was more alarming than anything else. It was as if she sensed the danger that surrounded us, and it was something more real than the fear I felt. I tried to return to normal life, but the more time I spent in the house, the more I felt its walls begin to close in. There was something ominous in the air that I couldn't explain. I tried to think that it was just stress, that it was the aftermath of the night's experiences. But every evening, when I found myself in front of the windows again, my gaze involuntarily went into the dark depths of the forest. The more I tried to ignore what was happening, the more the pressure grew. The strange noises in the night became unbearable. The crunching in the woods, as if someone was watching me, as if there was an invisible observer who was only waiting for the moment when I became weak. Sometimes it seemed to me that it was not just a sound, but a signal, something that indicated that I was not alone. And every time I tried to go outside, as soon as I approached the door, the footsteps became louder. Soon I stopped sleeping. I couldn't. Every moment my eyes closed, I felt like I was in the very place where it all began. That forest, those steps, that horror that tormented me, as if I were a part of it. There wasn't a single day when I didn't feel like something was following me. At first, it was strange movements in the corner of my field of vision, then sounds. But lately, I began to notice that someone was watching me. And it wasn't in the forest. It was happening right in the house. Sometimes I caught a shadow on the walls. Sometimes I heard footsteps behind the door. I tried to explain it to myself. It was just a trick of the light or my eyes. But with each passing day, my doubts grew stronger. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped out of bed. Instantly, I knew something was wrong. There was something in the darkness, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Footsteps, and then silence. An ominous, oppressive silence, as if the air itself had stopped moving. I opened the door carefully, trying to be quieter than a shadow, but as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a strange figure. It stood at the other end of the hallway, just for a moment, and its outline was so vague that I couldn't quite determine what it was. It was more than a shadow, but less than human. Elusive, incomprehensible. I tried to get closer, but the figure vanished into thin air, as if it were just a figment of my imagination. I found myself back in the same position as before, not knowing what was reality and what was my fears. I stood there in the hallway, frozen with terror. With every step I took, I felt like I was getting closer to something inevitable. Something big and sinister was hidden within those walls. Day after day, I watched the windows, trying to understand what was happening in the forest. But every time I went outside, the feeling that someone was watching me grew stronger. I felt that something in this house was holding me back, but I couldn't figure out what exactly. And against this background, the feeling of inevitability only grew stronger. Slowly, I began to realize that I was no longer in control of this situation. Fear was taking hold of me. Everything I had ever known about normal life seemed distant and irrelevant to what was happening now. This house, this forest, everything was saturated with something that was destroying me. Every day I felt like the thin thread that connected me to reality was breaking. I didn't know how much time I had left. There was something in this house that didn't let me leave. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I felt like I wasn't alone. With each new morning, I lost more time trying to figure out what was happening in this house. Everything around me was familiar, but every corner seemed foreign. I tried to find answers, but every time I thought I understood something, a new turn awaited me. Strange, frightening, and with no logical explanation. One evening, when the sky was overcast, I felt a strange pull toward the forest again. I knew it would lead to nothing good, but I couldn't stop. Everything inside me screamed at me to stay home, not to go there. But I couldn't. There was only one thought in my mind. I had to find out what this forest hides, what this house hides, this horror. Maybe that's where I'll find the answers. I took the flashlight, and this time I didn't put it off. Every minute of doubt, every glance at the door, at the walls, all this was draining me of strength. I didn't know what to do with this feeling that I was losing control, but I decided I can't wait any longer. I opened the door and stepped into a dark hallway that was as cold as the night outside. With every step I took, it seemed like it was getting harder to breathe, like the air was getting narrower, like the night I first heard the footsteps. But this time was different. I knew something was waiting for me. The forest was quiet, but it didn't calm me down. On the contrary, its silence only intensified the internal noise that was growing louder in my head. I walked forward, feeling the ground under my nails turn into a liquid mass, and my feet begin to slip. The further I went, the more I felt something invisible and merciless pulling me to where I didn't want to be. Every sound in the forest was too loud. Every movement was too strange. I felt my own steps disturbing the peace of nature, as if I were intruding on something sacred, something that should remain unknown. But I kept going. Something inside me was too strong to stop. Suddenly, I saw her. At the edge of the field where the forest became even denser, I noticed something dark, vague. It took me only a few seconds to realize that it was a figure. It stood there motionless, like a rock, watching me. My heart sank. I couldn't believe my eyes. This figure couldn't be real, but it was there. It stood there, as if it was waiting for me. I felt that horror again, that had penetrated me to the bone. I didn't know what to do. My hand gripped the flashlight, and the light penetrated the darkness. But the figure remained unclear, its outlines inexpressive. I couldn't take my eyes off her. My legs felt weak and fear gripped my body. I knew that if I took one step, she wouldn't go away. If I tried to run, she would follow me. I felt something cold and heavy fill my lungs, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the figure moved. It was so fast that I didn't have time to react. It moved toward the trees, leaving only dark traces behind it, as if its movements were leaving imprints in the air. I stood there, unable to move, unable to believe what was happening. But as soon as it disappeared into the darkness, I realized that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. I walked back into the house, not realizing how I had done it. My thoughts were in disarray. What was that? Who was that? I found myself back in familiar walls, but now those walls seemed even more alien to me. Even Harley didn't come near me. She sat in the corner, as if she didn't notice me. Dogs are known to sense when something is wrong, and her behavior only increased my fear. That night, I couldn't close my eyes. All I saw was the shadow standing in the forest, its silent presence that haunted me. I seemed to have lost touch with reality. I could no longer distinguish dreams from waking, the present from illusion. Every moment was filled with the expectation that she would return. And if she didn't, what would remain? I felt the same fear that had been with me all this time now creeping into other corners of my mind. I wasn't just being hunted. I was part of this game, part of something more sinister than I could have imagined. The days began to merge into one endless night. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. I hadn't managed to escape what I had started. And now I wasn't just alone in this house. I was its captive. It was becoming increasingly difficult for me to believe that I had ever lived a normal life. Every day here was an endless torture, not physical, but spiritual, mental, omnipresent. Time flowed differently in this house. Mornings could last an hour, and nights an eternity. I tried to mark the days, drawing lines on the wall in my bedroom, but on the third day the lines disappeared. It was as if the house didn't want me to know how much time had passed, as if it controlled the clock itself. Harley had changed too. She barked less and sat more and more often, staring at the same spot, the corner between the door to the hallway and the stairs to the second floor. There was nothing there. No sounds, no movements, only dust and old wallpaper. But Harley looked there every evening at exactly the right time, and did not look away until I turned off the light. And once, when I left the light on, she howled, long, drawn out, as if warning. I turned off the light, and she immediately fell silent. Sometimes I thought I heard someone walking around the house. Not footsteps, but like someone scraping their nails on the floor. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes right overhead. But every time I jumped up, grabbed a flashlight, and went to check, everything was empty. No tracks, no sounds. Just a hollow silence and a feeling that I had just been late, as if something had managed to disappear a moment before I arrived. I tried to leave. Once I packed my backpack, grabbed my keys, locked the door, and got in the car. Started it. Everything went smoothly. I drove about 100 meters and realized I was back on the driveway, right in front of the house. The trees were the same. The gate was open. The engine died on its own. I sat in the car for about 10 minutes, unable to move or breathe, until Harley started barking. She was standing at the porch like she was waiting, like she knew I would come back. Smells started to appear in the house, old, rotten, damp, as if something big had rotted somewhere in the basement. But the basement was clean. I checked, thoroughly, every corner. Even under the floor, there was nothing there. But the smell remained. It appeared closer to night and lasted until dawn, as if the very air in the house began to decompose after sunset. I began to have dreams, but I'm not sure they were dreams. In them, I was always in a house, but it was slightly different. The ceiling was too high, the doors too narrow. The wallpaper was breathing. I could feel it, the way it sucked in air, the way it fluttered in my presence. And then I heard knocking, first downstairs, then behind the bedroom wall, then right behind me. I would wake up sweating, feeling as if I had been touched. Sometimes I would actually find a mark, a thin line on my shoulder, like a fingernail. Sometimes a shadow on the sheets, as if someone had been sitting by the bed. But every morning the room would be normal again. Only I didn't feel normal. I started writing, not a diary, just notes, phrases, warnings to myself. Don't open the attic door. Don't look in the mirror after midnight. Harley knows everything. I didn't remember writing these phrases, but they appeared on the sheets of paper lying on the kitchen table. The handwriting was mine. The words were someone else's, as if someone was writing them through me. I went into the forest again, but this time I didn't find a clearing. The path I had taken in Chapter 6 was gone. In its place was a thicket that hadn't been there before. I wandered among the trees for almost an hour before I realized I was walking in circles, and each circle brought me closer to home, as if the trees were pushing me back. One day I found a photograph, an old one, black and white. It was of a man, tall and thin, with a shadow where his face should be. He was standing on the porch of a house, my house. On the back was written, "He stays until you go." I didn't know who it was, but from that night on, I started seeing him in reflections, in windows, in water, in Harley's eyes when she looked into the darkness. I don't close the doors anymore. It seems useless. Whatever it is, it's already inside. I feel it whispering to me as I fall asleep. I don't understand the words, but the meaning is clear. It's waiting, patiently, watching. I'm no longer a guest in this house. I'm a part of it. Sometimes I think that all this is a punishment, but for what? I don't remember what happened before this house. Faces, names, events, only fog in the road, as if it all started from here, as if I was brought here. And now I understand. This house doesn't want me to leave. It's not evil. It's just alive, and it chose me. Story 4. From a very young age, I felt eyes on me. They weren't intrusive. They weren't threatening in the usual sense, but they were constant, ethereal, always somewhere nearby, like a shadow that you can't see, but you know it's there. I often told myself that it was an illusion, nothing more than a childish suspiciousness caused by overwork, loneliness, or those stupid stories I read at night under the covers with a flashlight in my hand. Sometimes I even tried to smile at the empty room, hoping that whoever was watching would see that I wasn't afraid. It was a lie. When I was alone in my room, when the evening was dying down outside the windows and silence was falling behind the walls of the house, it seemed that the gaze was getting closer, as if it was entering me through the pores of my skin, tightening my breath, making my muscles tense. It became especially strong when my back was to the mirror. I hated mirrors, not because I saw something strange in them, but because I was afraid that one day I would see it. In my school years, all of this could still be explained by hypersensitivity. I was a normal teenager, even a little shy, but not excluded. I had friends, normal hobbies, but this fear, it lived inside me, quietly, like a hidden animal in the bushes. And yet I never told anyone about it. Not even my parents. Not even to myself out loud. Fear is a shadow that gets bigger when you illuminate it. I remember one time when I was in elementary school, I was standing at the blackboard, trying to remember the answer to a stupid math question, and suddenly, for no apparent reason, I was overcome by this feeling, as if the entire class, including the teacher, had gone silent and were looking right at me. I turned slowly, expecting laughter or a scream, but nothing happened. Everyone was still doing what they were doing, but I felt it. Sharp, invisible needles of attention, stabbing me in the back of the head. I told myself it was just stress. I was a kid who had trouble concentrating under pressure, but as the years went by, the feeling only grew stronger. As I got older, I began to notice a pattern. The quieter it got around me, the louder the silence inside became. It pulsed, had a life of its own, as if someone or something was always there, just unwilling to reveal itself. Sometimes I would hear a soft rustling, a slight cough, as if through the walls of a house. But when I froze, trying to pinpoint the source, it all disappeared. That's why I started sleeping with the light on. I was 11 and ashamed of it, but the darkness reinforced the illusion. I wasn't afraid of what could be seen. I was afraid of what couldn't be seen. The light didn't save me. It just made me less vulnerable. I imagined the brightness of the lamp burning their gazes, driving them away. Sometimes I fell asleep, pressed tightly against the wall, as if the wall could become a boundary between me and someone else. As time went on, I tried to adapt. I learned to dull my senses, to switch off, to escape into music, into books, into the noise of school corridors. And yet sometimes I caught myself turning sharply to the empty street, peering into the reflections of shop windows, looking for confirmation. There was none, and yet I knew. By the 8th grade, I had almost learned to live with it. I had almost convinced myself that it was an oddity, a quirk, perhaps even a personal peculiarity of perception, a neurotic glitch. To some extent, it even made me more attentive to those around me. I sensed people's moods, noticed head turns, facial expressions, the direction of their gaze long before they began to speak. It was as if I had become part of an invisible world, an observer of the observed. And then one moment happened that made everything inside freeze. I can't explain exactly why I felt it so intensely, but that day was different. It was as if someone's hand was clamped over my mouth from the inside. It was at school in the spring. I was sitting by the window, watching the wind blow through the trees in the schoolyard. Nothing special, but suddenly, without warning, I felt something strange. Not just a look, but a focus, a purpose, as if someone had finally stopped hiding. This look was heavier than the others, pulling me toward it. At first I thought it was one of the students, but when I slowly turned around, I saw a woman, a new teacher. She was unfamiliar to me, but something about her echoed painfully. She didn't blink. She looked at me as if she saw not just me, but something beyond me, beyond my essence. I knew she was more than human, or at least not like everyone else. After this incident, I began to be afraid again. My old fear, forgotten, dulled, returned with renewed vigor, and now it had taken shape. Before I was afraid of ghosts, feelings, emptiness. Now fear had a face. I started to doubt coincidences, unexpected phone calls, people standing at the bus stop and looking my way, a face in the window of a passing car. Everything became suspicious. I started avoiding mirrors, avoiding the dark, avoiding myself. I tried to talk to the doctor about it, but he chalked it up to teenage anxiety. He prescribed pills and explained their benefits. They really helped, not from fear, but from the feeling that it mattered. I became kind of muffled, emotionless, and for the first time since I was a kid, I was able to sleep in the dark. But something inside me did not calm down, because the dreams got worse, the eyes got closer. I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone was there, right next to the bed, in the deepest shadows. I couldn't prove it, but I didn't doubt it for a second. And then I realized, I am no longer an observer, I am a target. I don't know why she chose that day. Maybe she was waiting for the right moment. Maybe she was testing me to see how ready I was. Or maybe it had all been decided before I was born, and I was just following a taut string, like a puppet, not knowing who was pulling the strings. But it was in 9th grade, amid the boredom of school and the tired faces, that she showed up, Ms. Black. She walked into the classroom like a shadow. No greeting, no smile. Her eyes were too dark, as if the color of the iris was drowned in darkness. They did not seek contact, they drilled. Eyes that do not see, they open. No one noticed the strangeness. The students yawned, whispered, leafed through their notebooks, but I felt everything inside shrink. My body reacted before my mind. I could not understand why, but I wanted to disappear, to become glass, to dissolve into thin air. When she started the lesson, I didn't hear her words. My ears heard, but my brain didn't, because her gaze was fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't slide, didn't check. It stood there, like a needle in my neck. I felt that if I looked up, if I met her, something irreparable would happen. So I didn't look up. I looked at my desk, at my hands, at the pattern on the notebook page, while I screamed internally, begging for the bell to ring early. But the lesson lasted forever, not in minutes, but in breaths. Each breath was like a wet towel. I felt her presence breaking through the air. She didn't talk about me, but she spoke to me, not with words, but with existence. It was as if she already knew everything. I was open to her, like a book without a cover, and she turned the pages, choosing what to read. After class, my classmates started giggling. They had noticed her interest in me, but they took it as a joke. School doesn't leave anyone alone who stands out, even by accident, especially by accident. That day I was pushed, teased, blown kisses. And despite my inner tremors, I was glad. Glad that people were looking at me, that others were looking. Because those looks, no matter how mocking, were human. And what came from Ms. Black was not. I hoped she would go away, that it was a temporary replacement, and in a way it was. She never came back, but she didn't disappear. She just crossed a line. I didn't know it then, but I soon found out. That evening, as I walked to the bus with my friends, they continued their silly scenes, pretending to be in love with me, squealing and clinging. We laughed the way teenagers always laugh, loudly, stupidly, nervously. I almost felt relieved. Almost. But then I saw her. She was standing by her car, a small, dirty Kia, as if pulled out of a swamp. The car didn't suit her. She was out of this world. But the Kia was. The contrast was unpleasant. She was looking at me. Not at us, but at me, as if everything that was happening was a joke that she was tired of. At that moment, I realized that she was waiting. I don't remember how it all happened. It's a blur, like a bad dream. I only know that she was suddenly there. Her hand grabbed me, and I couldn't break free. I felt my feet lift off the ground, the metal of the car slide over my legs, the air in the car fill with rot. She tried to pull me inside. She did it silently. There were no words, just breathing, just effort. I didn't scream. I was just suffocating. My friends screamed, and thank God. If it hadn't been for them, if it hadn't been for this stupid, phony performance that had gone on all day, no one would have noticed. No one would have saved them. But they screamed. They called for help. And help came. The gym teacher, Mr. Elton, ran out into the street, and it was all over. I remember him pulling me out, pushing her away. I remember lying on the pavement, trying to figure out how to breathe. She didn't fight back. She just left, like it wasn't a failure, but something necessary. After that, my life was divided. My parents pulled me out of school. We moved. A series of visits to doctors and psychologists began. They said I had post-traumatic stress disorder, that I had to learn to let go of fear. But I couldn't. I knew this wasn't just a woman. This was something ancient, something that knew me. I tried to forget, but I couldn't, especially at night. When I slept, I felt her standing at the door. She didn't come in. She didn't need to. She was already inside. I had dreams in which she stood in a field. People were around her. They were silent. They were bowing. And in the center, I was there, a baby in a blue blanket. I couldn't understand where this image came from, but it was repeated over and over again. Then the pills started. They erased the fear. They erased everything. I became empty. But behind this emptiness, the question continued to live. Who is she? Over time, I convinced myself that this was just a terrible accident, a crazy woman, mentally unstable, all explainable, within reason. I almost believed it. Almost. But the look, that look, it wasn't human. When I returned to my parents' house after a long absence, the memories stuck to me like rusty nails. The air was familiar, almost too familiar. It smelled less of home than of the past, sealed in dusty corners and wooden floors. Everything was in its place, but it seemed as if each thing was watching me, just as it had before. The furniture hadn't moved an inch, the photographs on the walls still smiled too wide, and the stairs still creaked on the sixth step. I walked along those creaks as if in time with a once-forgotten ritual. My father said he needed help with spring cleaning, but that was just an excuse. He just needed to move mountains of junk from one room to another, from the first floor to the attic. He himself had been having trouble moving lately, complaining about his back, and judging by the look in his eyes, it was clear that he didn't want me to climb up, but he couldn't do it himself. The attic, the word itself always caused a strange tension in me. As a child, it was closed, as if something forbidden was kept there. I was never allowed to go up there, under any circumstances. My father was strict, and I did not ask unnecessary questions. At the time, I thought it was just a place with cobwebs and suitcases. Now I knew, if you are forbidden to go there your whole life, then there are no suitcases there. When he finally reluctantly agreed to let me go up there, I felt a strange relief, as if I were getting closer to the solution I had been searching for since early childhood, even if I didn't yet know what exactly I was looking for. The creaking of the attic stairs was louder than I expected. I climbed slowly, feeling myself getting colder with each step, as if the temperature was changing, not with altitude but with time, as if I were stepping over the boundary between now and then. When I got to the top, the first thing I saw was rows of boxes. Some were nameless, others were labeled with illegible letters. At first, I simply carried them around, as my father had asked. But when I got to the third box, he suddenly began to cough. At first, it was a normal cough, dry, irritated, but a second later, his hand clutched his chest and his fingers curled, as if he were fighting an invisible enemy. He started to fall and I lunged at him. It all happened fast. He lost his balance, tried to knock one of the boxes off the shelf, but he didn't have time. His body crashed onto the attic boards with a dull, brittle sound. His eyes darted around like a man who had lost control. I sank down next to him, shaking with fear and confusion. My mother came running upstairs as soon as she heard me scream. She jumped up to my father, then seemed afraid of me. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I was standing next to the boxes. The box that my father had looked at before he collapsed. I knew it right away. He was trying to hide it. Get it out of sight. But why? As they both focused on each other, I turned back to the box. Something was pulling me toward it. Not physically, but deeper. Like my name was being whispered through the cracks in its walls. I tore the tape, which had long since lost its stickiness, and peered inside. There were papers, old, stained, like mold or blood. The paper wasn't just paper. It felt alive. The fibers under my fingers were like hairs on an animal's skin. I felt sick, but I couldn't stop. There were writings on them. Phrases, words, dates, repeated prayers, mantras, names, all leading to one thing, the name Adam, the date, February 10, 2005, my birthday. My hands went cold. My heart began to pound dully, as if it were beating against a concrete slab. Everything in me rejected this discovery, but at the same time, it accepted it, as if I had been carrying the answer inside me all my life, but was afraid to ask the question. At the bottom of the box was a photograph, a Polaroid. In the center was a couple with a child, surrounded by people standing against a field. Above their heads was a thin crescent moon, and among those people were my parents, young, but recognizable. And the child, that baby. I looked closer, the features, the towel, the same age. It was me. The world started spinning. The floor dropped out from under my feet. I don't know how long I stood there clutching the photo. I only knew one thing for sure. They had been lying to me. All my life. My parents, the ones who called themselves mom and dad, they stood in a circle among others, and they held a child like a sacrifice, like a symbol, like a promise. This wasn't just a cult. This was ancient. So ancient that the words seemed not a plea but a statement. I didn't understand what ripe for the harvest meant, but I felt it was about me. And then I heard footsteps outside. I went to the attic window. Across the street stood a man in dark, just standing there and looking straight at me. His face was partially hidden by a hood, but his lips twitched. He didn't say a word, but I could read it in his eyes. Right, I ran. The wind tore the breath from my chest. Cold beads of sweat ran down my neck, and every movement felt like an attempt to escape from a sticky web. I don't remember exactly how I jumped from the tree, how I crossed the lawn, how I ended up on the next street. Everything merged into one. Panic, instinct, running. My brain was silent, but my body acted. I left my parents, the house, the street. None of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was to get as far away from that window and the man who stood on the other side of the road. I took the first bus I came across, then another, and again, without a goal, just movement, monotonous, meaningless, but the only right thing at that moment. People around me were looking at their phones, listening to music, reading books, and no one saw that I was suffocating inside, burning with fear. I caught reflections in the windows of the bus. Each glance at my face scared me more than the previous one. I didn't know this person in the reflection. I didn't know his story. I didn't know where he came from. I didn't sleep that night. I was sitting on a bench in some suburb near a store that had long since closed. The lights above the entrance were blinking and humming as if they knew something. I listened to every step, every rustle. It was impossible to tell who was coming, a passerby or someone who had come for me. Every silhouette that passed by made my stomach clench. What if it was him, the one from the street, or someone else? How many of them were there? I turned off my phone. I couldn't take any chances. They could track me through numbers, satellites, cameras. If they really had been watching me since I was a kid, couldn't they be everywhere? I was too scared to even text anyone, even my friends, even anyone who would believe me. I felt like every word was a beacon. They would see, they would know. On the second day, I couldn't feel my legs. My muscles ached. My stomach was in a tight knot. I ate only a bun from a vending machine and drank water from a public fountain. No one looked at me with suspicion. I looked like an ordinary student lost at the train station. But inside, everything was burning. I thought about that box all the time, about the papers, about the photograph. Not just thought about it, but it lived inside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that picture, the field, the sky, the crescent moon, and me, a baby, lying in the bundle like an offering. They stood there smiling as if they were proud to give me away. But to whom or to what? Not real all along. I tried to remember my childhood, to remember even one moment when something seemed wrong. Was there something in their behavior that gave away the lie? Or did I just not want to notice it? When I looked at my mother screaming into the phone, I saw real panic in her. And in my father, fear. But not for himself, not even for me, but for time. Like the clock was ticking, and they knew they were running out of time. That things weren't going according to plan. Maybe this is all part of something bigger. A cult, a sect, or something ancient, hidden, that no one talks about. And all they were trying to do was buy time, prevaricate, delay what was inevitable. And now this inevitable was chasing me. On the third day, I boarded a train at random. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't care. The main thing was to get away. I chose the farthest corner of the carriage, facing the wall, out of sight. The flickering landscapes outside the window meant nothing to me. I didn't recognize the area, and that made me happy. In an unfamiliar place, maybe they wouldn't find me. Although, if they've been looking for me all their lives, could a few hours on a train really make a difference? When the train stopped, I didn't get out right away. I waited until all the passengers had left the carriage. Then I slipped out, trying not to raise my head, not to catch glances. I went out onto the street and walked again, just forward, without a route, without a plan, past other people's houses, towards the forest. I stopped at an abandoned hut. It stood a little off the road, half ruined, with an open door, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, it smelled of mold and earth. It was quiet, very quiet, and for the first time in 3 days, I allowed myself to sit on the floor, hug my knees, and just sit. Not a single sound disturbed me, and this was more terrible than any rustle. Complete silence, complete loneliness, and only one feeling did not leave me. They are looking for me, not the police, not my family. Something else, something that knew my name before I could speak, something that called me ripe. I didn't know what that word meant, but it rang inside me like a death bell, and I knew I couldn't hold out for long. Sometimes silence is louder than a scream. I awoke in the gloom, shaking like leaves on a tree before a storm. My muscles ached from the awkward position in which I had fallen asleep, curled up on the cold floor of the hut, surrounded by rubble and damp dust. Dawn was seeping through the cracked boards of the roof, reminding me that another night had passed and I was still alive. My thoughts were tangled like tangled threads, none of which could be pulled out without touching the pain. I asked myself questions that no one could answer. There was no hint, no clue, only fear, dull as a howl underground. I knew I had to accept this not as temporary madness, not as a mistake, but as a new reality. I couldn't just be Charlie anymore. The name meant nothing. It was a mask given to me when I was born, or when I was stolen. With each passing hour, I became more and more convinced that my existence was not an accident, that I ended up with that family, with those people, was not a coincidence. It was a hiding, a hide and seek, perhaps an escape. I remembered the look in my father's eyes, not angry, not remorseful, but pleading, not the look of a guilty person, more like someone cornered who knows the truth, if brought to light, will save no one. I didn't blame him, not my mother. Maybe they were hostages. Maybe they had no choice. Maybe me too. I sat in silence and felt a strange pulsation. Not a sound, not a vibration, something inside, as if something alive responded to me when I saw those notes. Not names, not dates, but language, words that seemed to pass through me. My fingers then, holding the sheets, seemed to recognize those symbols. The horror is that I did not know from where. My body was increasingly reacting to this internal tension. Sometimes a shiver ran up my spine like electricity. Sometimes it felt like someone was touching the back of my head. And once, I couldn't breathe. My lungs didn't want to suck in air. I thought it was panic, but it was more like rejection, as if the flesh itself wasn't mine, as if someone inside disagreed. I emerged from the hut when the sun was high enough to illuminate the path. I needed to know where I was. I walked along a forest road, turned to a stream, and drank water from my hands. The landscape was serene, but the calm did not reach me. Everything that had once inspired confidence, the trees, the birds, the light, now seemed an indifferent backdrop to the unfolding tragedy. In the village, which I reached late in the afternoon, I found a library. Small, old-fashioned, smelling of dust and glue. The librarian didn't even glance in my direction. I slipped inside like a shadow and dove into the esoteric section, where old books stood on lopsided shelves. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just hoped that something would respond, and it responded. A book without a cover. yellowed pages, handwriting in the margins. Not a seal, but a manuscript. In the margins were those very words. It is ripe, be blessed, fruit of the harvest. I didn't believe in coincidences. Everything inside me tensed. Those phrases, they shouldn't be here. Not in a public library, not in the public domain. I didn't feel threatened, but rather an ominous recognition, as if the book had been written for me. I read about a cult, ancient, pre-Christian, connected to the cycles of the moon, fertility, and sacrifice. They believe that once every few generations, a carrier is born, someone who is connected to something beyond. They call him the ripe one, mature, ready to connect with the other. I threw up right in the corner of the reading room. When I got out, the sky was cloudy, and somewhere in the distance, the rain was approaching. I walked until I saw an empty bus stop. I sat down on a bench, closed my eyes, and began to breathe, slowly, controlling every movement of my chest. I had to choose. Give up or search, remain a fugitive or try to become a hunter. And then at that very moment, I felt it coming. Not footsteps, not a voice, but a shadow inside me. My pulse quickened. The air grew thicker. I opened my eyes and saw a silhouette across the street. It wasn't moving. It was just staring. A man or a woman. Impossible to tell. Too far away. But I knew it wasn't a man off the street. It was one of those. I felt a connection. Nasty, sticky, but undeniable. We knew each other, and when I blinked, he was gone. I stood up and walked the other way, calmly, with restraint. I wasn't running anymore, because now I knew something important. They couldn't just take me. They needed me to want to go myself. So that I mature, I stopped only at dawn in the half-ruined building of an old greenhouse. It smelled of dampness, rusty iron, and forgotten time. The light of the morning sun was shining through the broken glass, coloring the dust in the air orange gold. The silence here was different. Not peaceful, but deafening. Like in a sarcophagus, like in a grave. I curled up in a corner, between rusty heating pipes and dusty boxes with dried roots. My body didn't care where I lay. My head was buzzing. My consciousness was burning. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the moon. Only it wasn't a celestial body, it was a face that knew me. I was no longer sure that my past really belonged to me. That I grew up in an ordinary family, went to an ordinary school, fell in love, quarreled, took exams. All of this suddenly became some kind of decorative facade, knocked together only so that I would not look inside. Not look where something ancient lived inside me, stirred, holding its breath. From the moment I saw that photograph and felt those disgusting papers in my hands, time seemed to go backwards, or to stop moving altogether. Space became viscous, events became symbols, people became shadows. And in this new system of coordinates, I stood at the very center, uninvited but necessary. They were waiting. Not someone in particular. I wandered the streets trying not to linger in one place. The past seemed to fall from the sky, scraps of newspapers, abandoned fragments of posters, fragments of dreams. One of them is especially haunting. I am standing in a circle cut into the ground. Under my feet is salt, ash, and what looks like bones. There are hooded faces around me, but I can see them. I recognize them. Some are my teachers, some are neighbors I thought were weird, and one is a man from the bus I took home from school one day. Back then, he just smiled. Now he whispers. When I woke up from these visions, my chest hurt, as if someone was squeezing my heart from the inside. I felt other people's thoughts more and more often. I didn't hear them. I didn't guess them. I felt them. They weren't mine, but they were there. As if someone was trying the door that I was holding with all my might. It didn't feel like madness. Madness is frightening, but it leaves room for doubt. No, it was obsessive knowledge. Knowledge without a source, without an explanation. One evening, wandering into a half-abandoned hostel on the outskirts, I came across an old map. It was hanging on the kitchen wall, circled in pen in several places. One circle was drawn where I was born. The second was near a village where I had recently spent the night. And the third was drawn right where I was standing. Suddenly, everything inside me screamed. My heart sank. I tore the map out, rolled it up, and ran down the stairs. I knew it was a sign. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trace. A tiny piece of a plan I'd been woven into long before I was born. I didn't know by whom, why, or the scariest part, if I'd agreed to it. I didn't believe in fate, but I began to suspect that it believed in me. From that night on, I began to look for the same signs. They appeared in small things. In a folded pattern on the pavement, in a faded inscription on a garbage can, in a strange-sounding word on a poster. They all said the same thing: the time has come. And every time I began to doubt, something happened that returned to me this feeling of observation. This connection did not weaken. On the contrary, it grew stronger. One day I stood on a bridge looking down at the muddy water. The wind was blowing in my face. It was quiet, and suddenly I felt someone standing behind me. I turned around. No one. Only the wind and the bridge. But I knew I was not alone, and not even together. I was between worlds. Once, perhaps, I would have considered myself a victim, or the chosen one. But now I knew. I was a tool, a key, a catalyst. Something had to come through me. Something that shouldn't be here, but did. Maybe once it was called a god. Maybe a demon. Now it was just the force. I didn't ask to be a part of this. I didn't want to know that there was something different, something ancient, something alien in my blood. But the knowledge had seeped into me like rain through a roof, unstoppable. And now I couldn't take myself back. Every day I felt myself becoming smaller, the emptiness inside me growing. I still thought, felt, remembered. But that was in the background. In the foreground stood another reality, and it was looking at me. Sometimes I caught myself speaking in a voice that wasn't my own, or I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the expression in my eyes, as if someone was rehearsing in my body, trying it on. I didn't know how much longer I could hold myself together, but I knew the denouement was near. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs carried me forward. Through the night streets, where the light of the street lamp seemed painful, revealing not cracks in the asphalt, but cracks in reality itself. Everything around me was losing its outline, as if the world no longer had to be logical. I increasingly caught myself thinking that I didn't believe in what I saw, or on the contrary, that I believed too much. Somewhere beyond the city limits, the old fields began. Once upon a time, wheat was grown here. Now there were only rotten stalks, broken by wind and time. I found myself there before dawn. The road I had been following disappeared somewhere beyond the last farm, turning into a trampled path leading deep into a formless wasteland. There, among the dry ears of corn and weeds, stood a stone slab, alone. There were no inscriptions or symbols on it, only a hollow in the center, perfectly shaped like a human palm. I didn't think, I didn't analyze. I just walked up to it and put my hand there. The cold of the stone immediately penetrated my bones. And at that moment, I remembered everything. I remembered not as a person, but as a vessel. I remembered not individual events, but the feeling of being someone else. The one who watched, waited, lived outside of time. The one for whom my life is just a preparation, a shell, a stage. I was chosen once, not by right, not by desire, not by merit. I was created, born, raised, infused with the right words, genes, fears, and dreams. And all this for one moment, awakening, or, as they called it, the harvest. Those who watch, they do not live in cities. They do not hide behind masks. They are something greater, something ancient. Their bodies are made of fog, of rustling, of twilight. They existed long before the first languages, long before man learned to call fears by name. They fed on our attention, our faith, our spiritual cracks. And every century they come, not right away, first in signs, in voices, in memory failures, then in people like me. I am not the Messiah. I am an opening. I am a crack in the boundary between worlds. And everything that was my life turned out to be just a preface. As a child, I thought that the surveillance of me was just a phobia, that the strange looks were an accident, that Ms. Black's madness was an episode. But all of this was stages, ritual signals, tuning into a frequency. I pulled my hand away from the stone and immediately heard the earth around me move, not under my feet, but under the skin of the world, as if the field itself had sighed. There was no moon or stars above my head. The sky was flat, black, blind. But I felt something looking at me, not through the window, not from the darkness, but from inside me. Suddenly I felt warmth. The pulse in my chest changed. My body contracted, then relaxed, as if another organism had awakened inside me. Not an alien one, but the original one. I fell to my knees. The taste of iron filled my mouth. My eyes watered, but I couldn't take my eyes off the horizon, where something was appearing that defied description. Not a being, not a figure, presence. It didn't go. It unfurled like a scroll, like fabric sliding through the air. And I knew it didn't need a name, that it knew mine. It knew every second of my existence, every thought, every doubt. It didn't come to destroy, it came to use. At that moment, I realized that everything I had thought of as struggle, as fear, was resistance to awakening. And now I was awake. I stood up. The world had not changed. The fields remained gloomy. The stone still stood in the middle of desolation. but I felt the space around me become denser. The wind had stopped. Time stood still. I felt power, not like in the movies, not like magic, but like a weight filling every cell. I became the fulcrum. I became the beginning. Now they could come. They who lived in the void between the blinks. They whose faces were never meant for human sight. They who were the source of the tales of demons, angels, gods. They who knew that humanity was merely a temporary phenomenon, a way to hold energy and faith. I didn't know how much I had left. Little of the human part. Maybe just a shell. Maybe just an idea of who I was. A name. Memories of my parents, of my friends, of school, of Miss Black, of home. All of it was weight now. It would all soon be gone. But before that, I had to choose. I felt like the choice was real. I could let it happen. I could be the gate. I could open the way. Or I could try to close it. The price is probably my life, or soul, or something else that has no name. But if I don't do anything, they will pass. And then the sky, the rivers, the trees, the cities, the people, everything will be different. For the harvest is not in gathering the fruits. The harvest is in replacing reality. They will not come for us. They will come in our place. Standing on that field, my body shaking with strength I hadn't asked for, I realized I might be the last one able to say no. Or maybe the first one to say yes. Story 5. I never looked for anything serious online. I liked games, not so much for the gameplay, but for the feeling of control. In virtual worlds, I could be anyone. Put on a mask, talk as much as I wanted, and disappear if I felt uncomfortable. That was the case back then. I just went in to relax. Another world of familiar interface, faceless characters with loud nicknames and short messages in the chat. He showed up by accident. I don't even remember who sent the first emoji or suggested teaming up. It was easy without unnecessary tension, as if we already knew each other. We played like partners, in sync, without unnecessary words. He didn't try to flirt. He was just there. He respected the space, didn't ask questions. This was new to me. I was used to people who intruded, to those who demanded attention, reaction, emotions, and he was just there, without asking for anything in return. Gradually, we began to communicate outside the game. First about missions and strategies, then about fatigue after work, about bad coffee, about the winter that just wouldn't go away. I didn't know what he looked like. He knew almost nothing about me. We didn't say names, and that made it even safer. No expectations, no strings attached, just a keyboard, a screen, and the ease that I quickly got used to. This went on for weeks. We played almost every night. We talked as if we had been friends all our lives. I felt something shifting inside me, as if something that had been frozen for a long time was warming up. I felt warm just from his presence in the chat. There was no voice, no face, just words, and that was enough. And then he suddenly disappeared. At first, I didn't pay attention to it. Everyone has things to do. Sometimes people get tired. I went into the game. He was gone. A day later, empty again. A week, silence. I tried not to think, distracted myself, made up excuses. But something inside was already screaming, why does it hurt so much to lose a person I don't even know? He came back a couple of weeks later with a short message. He was leaving the game. He couldn't do it anymore. He had no time. He had problems in his life. It all sounded distant, like it was just a formality. And yet he left me a contact. If I wanted, I could write. I looked at this message and didn't know what to do. If I wanted, I wrote. And so a new stage began. We were no longer players. We became people, real people. The messages were no longer avatars, but bodies, faces, biographies. He admitted that he was married. I remember reading this and freezing. Something sank inside. I wasn't angry. He hadn't promised anything. He hadn't lied, but it hurt because I began to feel. And feelings in such a situation are always a loss. We stopped communicating. It was a mutual silence. He left and I didn't call. It felt right to retreat. I didn't want to be the one who destroys. I didn't want to intrude into someone else's life, even if that life was already cracked, even if perhaps someone needed me. Several months passed. I tried to forget. I deleted correspondence, threw away thoughts, but my memory stubbornly held on to smells, fragments of phrases, those strange evenings when I felt real, not lonely, not broken, not superfluous, but needed. And then he came back. He wrote as if there hadn't been months of silence between us. He told me that he was getting a divorce, that everything had fallen apart a long time ago, that he had tried to save me, but it hadn't worked, that he had been thinking about me all this time. I didn't know how to react. Part of me was happy, frankly like a child, and the other part was cautious. I didn't know how much truth there was in it, and I didn't want to be hurt again. He asked to meet, not as a couple, not as something romantic, just to say hi in person. I refused. I was scared. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted it too much. It was risky. He wasn't officially divorced yet. The papers weren't signed. His ex-wife was still in his life, albeit formally. And me? Who am I in all this? We continued to communicate, without haste, without pressure. I felt that something real was growing between us. Not a game, not flirtation, not romance, but a quiet affection. As if two tired people had found shelter in each other, and I was afraid of losing it again. I found myself smiling at his messages, waiting for him. My day was warmer when he was around, even if it was from a distance. It was strange, so fast, so strong, and so unreal. I caught myself daydreaming, and then I stopped myself. After all, his life hadn't completely fallen apart yet. I couldn't be sure that I wouldn't have to retreat again, and yet I couldn't tear myself away. He became someone who listens, someone who doesn't ask for more than I can give, someone who isn't afraid to talk about pain, who doesn't hide behind jokes. We were honest with each other, as much as distance allowed. I didn't know where this was going, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. Because now, for the first time in a very long time, I felt good. I don't remember when exactly I decided that the meeting would take place. It wasn't a sudden epiphany or an impulsive emotional decision. It matured in me slowly, like warm water filling a vessel. I would wake up in the morning and think about what it would be like to sit next to him, to hear his voice, to see not the text on the screen, but the face opposite. At first it was scary, then it became attractive. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wrote to him in the evening, when the rain was running down the glass in thin lines. He answered almost immediately, without surprise, as if he knew that I would write right now. We chose a day, a place, nothing romantic, just a cafe in the center. I tried to keep in mind that this was not a date, not the beginning of something, just a meeting, just looking into the eyes. The day passed slowly, like thick honey. I was distracted, then caught myself thinking about him again. I replayed in my head 100 times how it would go, what phrases I would say, how I would react if he was embarrassed, if he had changed, if there was no magic between us that was in the letters. I was afraid of being disappointed, afraid of disappointing him. I arrived first, 15 minutes early. Out of nerves, I didn't want to go in and see if he was late. It was easier to sit and wait. I chose a table by the window and ordered coffee to keep my hands busy. Outside, everything was familiar. Cars, people, wind. But inside, it was a whirlwind. Every step toward the door made my heart speed up. He didn't walk in abruptly, not like in movies where everything freezes. He just appeared, as if he had always been part of this picture. I recognized him immediately, even without photographs. He was as I imagined him, not model-like, not bright, but correct. He had tired eyes and kind shoulders. Yes, kind. I can't explain it any other way. He came over and I stood up. We didn't hug, we didn't shake hands, we just looked at each other for a few seconds, as if two parallel lines had shifted at that moment, breaking the law. I didn't expect the emotions to surge so strongly. I held on, but something inside was melting. He sat down opposite me and we started talking about the road, about the cafe, about coffee, nonsense, anything to avoid talking about the main thing. But it got easier with each passing minute, as if we had removed invisible armor. I listened to his voice. It was deeper than I expected, warm, enveloping. He looked straight at me without embarrassment, and I understood. This was not flirting, not an attempt to prove something. He was just being real, without filters, like those nights when we played, only now for real. He talked more than I did, about the divorce, about the house where everything reminded him of the past, about how difficult it is to share not things, but habits, how every morning becomes a minefield. I listened silently. I didn't need to ask questions. Everything he said sounded like a confession that had been carried inside for a long time. I told him about myself too, about the loneliness that comes not at night, but during the day, when no one notices, about the fear of getting close, about how easy it is for me to disappear. He didn't judge, he just listened, nodding. Sometimes he looked with such attention, as if every word I said was a fragile thing that he was afraid to drop. Time flew by. Coffee gave way to tea. The streets outside the window grew dark. The cafe became quieter. And suddenly there was that very pause. Not awkward, but real. We were simply silent, and there was more meaning in that silence than in all the words spoken. For the first time, I felt that everything was right, that I was in the right place. When we walked out, the air was cold. I thought, everything is fine. Even if this is where it ends, even if tomorrow we become lines in a chat again, This evening was real, alive. He looked at me, and I saw in his gaze not a request, not hope, just gratitude. For coming, for being there. We parted. No kisses, no promises. He went one way, I went another. But something inside me had changed. I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel disappointed. It was warm. It was calm. I didn't know what would happen next, and for the first time, it didn't scare me. I was walking home and thinking, even if it all ends here, this moment can't be taken away. It will stay with me, as proof that it was not in vain, that feelings born in pixels can come to life, that even the quietest stories have the right to continue. After the meeting, everything became strange. It was as if I stood on the border of two worlds, and neither one wanted to let go. I would wake up in the morning and not know how I felt. The lightness from that evening still lived inside me, but with it came anxiety. We hadn't agreed on anything. We hadn't set up a new meeting. We hadn't discussed what this meant. Everything was there, and nothing was there. He wrote the next morning, a short message, almost neutral, that it was nice, that he was glad to see me in person. I smiled but didn't answer right away. I read and reread, as if there could be something more hidden in those words. But there wasn't. There were just his thoughts, direct, without hints, without expectations. I answered only in the evening, briefly. We had not crossed that invisible line that separates a chance meeting from something real, but we had not grown distant either. We had simply become closer, more real. Now I knew how he moved, how he bit his lip when he listened, how he laughed when he could not hold back. For some reason, these little things meant more than all the words. The next few days dragged on like a long line of gray canvases. We wrote to each other, but less. I didn't know if he was deliberately pausing or just didn't want to impose himself. I kept my distance myself. Not because I didn't want to be closer, but because I was afraid that he might disappear if I got too close. A strange fear, isn't it? To be afraid of losing something that never officially existed. Closer to the weekend, he wrote again, that he wanted to see me, not because he missed me, not because there was something stormy and passionate between us, but simply because I was calm. He used that word, calm, and I realized that he felt the same as I did. Not a storm, not a flame, but a quiet, steady warmth. Like a fireplace in a house where it was raining. We met again, this time in the park. We walked along the alleys among the fallen leaves. Autumn was in full swing, and everything seemed a little slow. We spoke little. We looked more. I caught myself listening to myself. Was I drawn? Was I shaking inside? And every time I was surprised, no, I just felt good. Without expectations, without strain, without trying to be someone. He didn't try to take my hand. He didn't come closer than the personal space allowed. But I didn't need protection next to him. It's a rare feeling when you're next to a man and you don't think that you have to please, seduce, prove yourself. I could be myself, tired, silent, and he took it for granted. For at some point we sat down on a bench. There were almost no people around, just passers-by in the wind. He said he was afraid of a repeat, that there were too many circles in his life. Approach, flash, distance, pain. I didn't answer. I just sat next to him. I knew this feeling. I lived it too. I was afraid that he would become a new circle, another turn that I would have to move away from again. But I looked at him and saw no threat, no usual desire to possess, no attempt to stick a label. He was who he was, a man with weariness inside, but with kindness that had not faded. And I felt that with him you could just be, not necessarily love, not necessarily build something, just be. And maybe that's enough. When I came home, I didn't turn on the light. I sat in the dark. The room smelled of a blanket and books. I thought, maybe I should be more afraid. Maybe I'm taking a step into the void again, only softer, more imperceptibly. But there was no panic, only silence and confidence. Now everything is happening as it should. He wrote before going to bed. Thank you for coming. I wrote back quickly. Thank you for calling. It wasn't much, almost nothing. But I fell asleep feeling like everything was falling into place. No confessions, no steps forward or backwards. We just lived, day after day, not texting every night. Sometimes just a meme, sometimes a voice message. But with each passing week, he became closer. Not as a man, as a person whose presence calms. I didn't call it love. I didn't dare. That would have been too loud. But inside there was a growing feeling that maybe I wasn't alone anymore. That maybe for the first time in a long time, I was letting someone in. Not like someone barges in, but like someone who enters, taking off their shoes at the door. Sometimes I wake up and feel like he's there. Not physically, not in bed, not in the apartment, not within arm's reach. Somewhere in the space between thoughts, in the rhythm of making coffee, in the pause when I scroll through messages and catch myself waiting for his name, in the silence, especially in it. We were still not together. Not a couple, not lovers, not he and she in the traditional sense, but he was still part of my days. Like the background, like the music playing in the next room, barely audible but setting the tone. From the outside, it probably looked strange, too soft, too calm, too frivolous. But inside, everything was different. There was none of the anxiety that usually comes with not knowing where you stand, because I knew I was standing on the ground, not floating, not falling, just standing there, confidently, firmly, and so was he. We didn't correspond for days. Sometimes he would disappear for a day or two. Sometimes I would. But this didn't cause panic. There was no thought, he's cooled off. No reflex, I need to ask what's wrong. We both lived our own lives, but in this life, there was a place for each other. Not the center, not the meaning, just a place. And this was, oddly enough, important. I started to notice how much I had changed. Before, I would analyze every little thing. How many messages, how quickly he responded, how many hearts at the end. Now I just read, smiled, and continued my day. Without hype, without schemes. He became part of my peace, not anxiety. And this was even more frightening than if he had caused passion, because peace is about seriousness, about the present. One day I realized, I don't expect anything from him. And this is the paradox, because it was precisely in this lack of persistence that the main depth was. I didn't expect confessions. I didn't expect him to invite me to dinner, to kiss me, to say that he missed me. But if this had happened, I wouldn't have been surprised. I would have simply accepted it, the way one accepts the morning light, without delight, but with gratitude. He began to appear more often, not in the house, not in life, but in his presence. He wrote when he was feeling good, sometimes when he was feeling bad. I answered not as a savior, not as a lover, not as a psychologist, simply as a person who was nearby. It is amazing how much you can give while remaining at a distance. Sometimes it seemed to me that all this was an illusion, that I had invented him, invented this connection, this softness between us. That in reality we were just friends, just passing interlocutors whose periods in life coincided. But then he would write something simple, ordinary again, and I would feel, no, this is not an invention. This is really happening, just on a different plane, not the one I am used to. Sometimes I caught myself missing him. Not him, but us, the way we were silent together, the way we looked at each other, the way he listened. This boredom was light, without pain, without emptiness, just a gentle reminder. I felt good in his presence, and that meant it might be good again. I stopped waiting for a call, stopped checking when he was online. These habits die slowly, but one day they just disappear. I learned not to drag it out, neither him nor myself. Everything flowed as it should, without jerks, without exhalations. Sometimes he asked to meet, sometimes he just disappeared. I was not offended. I disappeared too. Because the world did not revolve around communication. We both remained the center of our orbits, simply occasionally drawn to each other. One evening, when it was raining outside and I covered myself with a blanket, I suddenly thought, what if he is just a person who came to teach me not to be afraid of loneliness? Not love, not relationships, but to be alone and feel complete. After all, this is exactly what I felt next to him, completeness, even when he was not there. I knew a week or two could pass and he wouldn't write. He could leave, disappear, like chance encounters come and go. But now I wasn't holding on. I wasn't seizing the chance, because I understood that if he left, something would still remain in me. Part of that silence, part of that peace that he brought. I didn't want to call it a thing. There was no need for labels. Sometimes the most important connections don't fit into words. They just exist, undefined, unframed. And maybe that's why they're real. With him, I felt for the first time, I don't need to be wanted to be important. I don't need to be needed to be needed. It's enough to be. It was the quietest but most powerful feeling I've ever known. I didn't notice when exactly it started. It all happened slowly, as if someone was turning the volume knob inside me, adding sounds so gradually that at first I thought the silence had simply become brighter. And then I realized I was starting to miss not only what had happened, but also what never happened between us. I suddenly started to wonder, what if we had really tried? Not by chance, not in passing, not fleetingly, but for real, with commitments, with confessions, with attempts to let each other in deeper. What if he had held my hand not at parting, but at the beginning? What if he had not just written when it was convenient, but had really wanted to be there? These thoughts came not as melancholy, but as a soft obsession. I was not jealous. I did not suffer. I did not demand. I simply imagined, quietly, almost dreaming, sometimes in the warm water of the shower, sometimes while looking out the window in the morning. while the sun squinted through the blinds. There was no pain or resentment in these thoughts, only tenderness, as if I allowed myself to want a little more. He was still there. We corresponded, shared strange thoughts, news, even dreams. He knew how to listen, and I increasingly found myself talking to him more than to anyone else. But there was still a shadow between us, not an obstacle, not a cold, but a shadow, something that casts the silhouette of something that is not there. And then I realized everything between us, no matter how calm and honest it is still based on the fact that neither of us wants to cross the line. Not because it's scary, but because it's easier. Because no one wants to be the one to say, I want more, because that's always followed by either me too or silence. And silence is much more frightening. I didn't know if he wanted more. I didn't ask. We were so comfortable in our half form that even the thought of talking felt like an intrusion. But something inside me was changing. I couldn't pretend I had enough anymore. Not because it wasn't enough. It wasn't. I was just starting to feel trapped in my own quiet. That same quiet that had once been a blessing, but now felt like a glass cage. Transparent, but unbearably confined. Every day I noticed how I began to see the world differently. How I stopped enjoying his rare messages. How I froze not from excitement, but from fatigue. How I read his words, knowing that there would be nothing new behind them. Everything was the same. Everything was smooth. Everything was painless, and this became pain. I didn't blame him. He didn't promise. He didn't call. He didn't give me hope. Everything between us was voluntary, honest, even careful. But it was an honesty that allowed you not to take responsibility. An honesty you could hide behind. I did that too, but now I couldn't. Sometimes I caught myself reading his correspondence and feeling nothing. No warmth, no irritation, just emptiness between the lines. As if everything was fine, only the emotions were switched off. And then I realized, I will either start demanding more or I will start letting go. I didn't want to become someone who wanted certainty. I've always been proud of my independence, my ability to not cling. But isn't that a form of fear? Isn't it easier to be indifferent than to admit what's important to you? Because then you have something to lose. And I didn't want to waste any more time. I didn't want to stay in the shadows when I could be in the light. I didn't want to be there when being there meant nothing. Because at some point, and I knew it for sure, I would start to distance myself, slowly, not out of anger, but simply because I couldn't stay in the shade when everything inside me was asking for color. I didn't know how he would react, and perhaps this was my greatest weakness. I still hoped that he would feel the same, that he would also want to take a step towards me, that all this was not just a pleasant proximity of souls, but the beginning of something real. But now I was ready to hear something else, even if it was no, because inside I could already hear, you're ready to either move on or close the door, not because I was disappointed, but because I finally understood what I wanted, not what I wanted from him, what I wanted from myself. I was quiet as always, reserved. I said nothing, but my thoughts were already waiting in line to exit, and I knew that soon they would break out, that soon I would choose to stay and beg or to leave and save myself. And in any case, it would be a step, the first step in a long time. Sometimes you don't realize how deep you've gone until you look back and see how far the shore is. I woke up to a silence that was not at peace. It no longer lulled me. It no longer protected me. It was as if it revealed something I could no longer ignore. He was slipping away without even taking a step. It's amazing how much we can invent for ourselves just to avoid feeling lonely. I justified his silence by being busy, his absence by circumstances, his detachment by character, anything just to avoid telling myself the simple truth. If a person wants to be there, they will be there, and not in fragments, not in bits and pieces, not in remnants of someone else's day, but in their entirety, completely, with themselves, not just with letters on a screen. I remembered how he used to text me first, how there was a sense of urgency in his messages, as if he was eager to share, to hear, to be heard. Everything seemed alive then. I caught the rhythm of his thoughts, answered without looking at my watch, read again, read into the pauses. We were on the same frequency. Or so I believed. And now I refreshed the feed, knowing that there would be nothing new. No longer with anticipation, but rather out of habit, like people touching a burn to make sure the pain is still there. So I checked. Is everything still empty? I didn't blame him. He hadn't promised anything. But maybe that was what hurt the most, that he hadn't promised anything. No reason, no hope to cling to. Just an open door that I had walked through myself, and now I had to walk out. I became more distant with each passing day. Not out of spite, but simply because something inside me was tired of hoping. I stared at my phone and didn't reach out. I didn't wait. I didn't text first. Not because I was playing the silent game, but because I no longer felt the impulse. The place that had once been warm had become cold, and I didn't want to go back there. It felt strange, like I was mourning something that never happened. We weren't together. We didn't even call it something, and yet I missed him. I missed the man who was there for me without words, the attention that never came back. I missed myself, the one who was alive in his presence. I tried to remember when exactly the turning point had started. Maybe it was when I first read his text and didn't smile, or when he texted and I didn't respond right away because I didn't feel like I should. I didn't feel responsive, or maybe it started even earlier, when he stopped asking how I was sleeping, how my day was going, how I was feeling. Little details that had seemed ordinary before now cut like a razor. He still wrote from time to time. He responded. Sometimes he even joked. But something had changed. I no longer heard interest in his words, only politeness, dry concern, and that was worse than silence. And then I realized, I don't feel pain from his indifference. I feel pain from my own illusion. From the fact that I wanted it so much for it to be something that I didn't notice. All this time I loved not him, but the image that I myself created. This discovery was like a blow, but an honest one. For the first time in a long time, I felt myself returning to myself. Not to us, not to him, but to myself. To the one who knows how to be alone and not lose herself in anticipation. To the one who no longer confuses attention with affection. To the one who knows if a person is truly important, he will not be a background. He will become a part. I picked up my phone. I deleted his number. Not out of anger, not out of passion, just as a fact. He was no longer part of my story, and that was part of growing up too. Being able to let go without tearing yourself apart, without reproaching, without dramatizing, just moving on. Sometimes things end quietly, without scandals, without tears, without goodbyes. You just realize at some point you are no longer there, and you don't want to go back. After I deleted his number, there was a strange clarity. Not relief, not victory, just clarity, like after a long thunderstorm. The room was still overcast, but at least it wasn't thundering anymore. Days passed and I did not write. Not because I was struggling with myself, I simply did not want to. It was as if the sound had been turned off inside. All thoughts, dialogues, attempts to understand, explain, justify, disappeared. Only silence remained. I thought it would hurt more. I was preparing myself for breakdowns, sleepless nights, weaknesses, but none of that came. It turned out that the pain I expected, I had already experienced. It didn't go away in a day. It just gradually retreated until I noticed that I no longer carried it with me every minute. The world hadn't changed. People around me were still rushing to work, discussing the weather, posting photos of their cats and coffee. Only now I looked at all of this with a new distance, as if I had returned from a long journey that no one had seen. I started walking more. Not because I was looking for meaning or answers, but because I just wanted to move. To walk without a goal, without a direction, to look at the windows of other people's houses and imagine what was going on inside. It was strangely calming, the knowledge that everyone has their own story, their own joys, their own losses. My pain is not unique, but it was still mine. At some point, I caught myself thinking that I didn't remember what his voice sounded like. It scared me, because once he was everything, an echo in my head, the background of my sleep, the rhythm of my day, and now he was fading, like a faded inscription, like a fingerprint on fog glass. I was afraid to forget, and at the same time, I wanted to. One day I saw his photo on social media. By chance, someone posted a picture where he was in the corner of the frame. He was laughing. He was with someone. He seemed light, free, alien. And at that moment I realized he was already where I was not, and probably never was. I was just entering his life as a guest, and he did not become a part of mine. I closed the screen. I felt neither anger nor resentment, just a slight tingling, as if something had shifted inside. Like when a broken tooth stopped hurting, and now you just can't help but touch it with your tongue, checking, did everything really go right? I stopped talking about him, even in my thoughts. His name no longer came up in conversations with friends, was not in the drafts of messages, did not appear in the search bar. He faded, and with him, the old me, the one who hoped, waited, got lost. Now I was different, quieter, slower, more alert. Not bitter, just attentive. I learned to hear myself where before I had been preoccupied only with the other person. And in that silence, I began to discern a voice, my own, unfamiliar, uncertain, but real. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't make plans. I didn't fantasize. I just lived. I watched the clouds change, the passers-by wrap themselves in scarves, The leaves under my feet turned to dust. Everything flowed, everything went, and I went along with it. There were evenings when it became lonely, but loneliness no longer seemed like an enemy. It became something like a room with an open window. A little chilly, a little empty, but you could breathe freely. One day lying in bed, I realized that I hadn't thought about him all day. Not because I forbade myself. There was simply no reason. My life was filled with other details. Books, the morning light on the wall, the voice of the neighbor's child behind the wall. And I felt gratitude, not to him, to myself, for not breaking down, for going out, for choosing myself. We often think that we are being abandoned, but sometimes it is we ourselves imperceptibly, almost unconsciously, who leave. Because we can no longer stay, because we hear how something in us is dying down, and then all that remains is to go, silently, without scenes, without applause, without final words.